The admissions clerk didn't look up from her screen when she said it. Your policy's been suspended. No active coverage, no admission. You'll need to make a cash deposit or find another facility. Nyla Baptiste was 34 years old, 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, standing in the lobby of the hospital that bore the name of her own blood family. Though she didn't know that yet, while a contraction tore through her lower back so hard, her vision went white at the edges. Paid my premiums, Nyla said, every single month. The system shows non-payment as of 48 hours ago. The clerk finally looked at her. Not with cruelty, with the flat efficiency of someone who had stopped seeing people as people a long time ago. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do. Someone did this. Someone canceled her insurance 2 days before her due date. Someone looked at a pregnant woman's file, picked up a phone, and made a decision. If you've ever been told no when your life was on the line, drop your city in the comments. And if this kind of story keeps you up at night, subscribe and hit that bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain in Seattle in November doesn't fall so much as it accumulates. It gets into everything: your collar, your shoes, the space between your shoulder blades, and it stays there, cold and patient, like something that has decided to outlast you. Nyla stood inside the automatic doors of Myru Pacific Medical Center and listened to the sound of her own breathing between contractions. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way the birthing class instructor had demonstrated 3 weeks ago in a community center on Capitol Hill, in front of a room full of couples with their matching water bottles and their shared anxieties. Nyla had gone alone. She'd brought a notepad. She'd written down everything. She was 34 years old, and she had managed investment portfolios worth more than $40 million. She had rebuilt her credit from a 580 to a 791 after a contract collapse gutted her income 2 years back. She had done that while pregnant, while grieving a relationship that ended without explanation, while learning to sleep on the left side of a queen bed because every book said that was better for the baby. She had done everything right. The admissions clerk, a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, had looked at Nyla's insurance card the way someone looks at a foreign currency they don't recognize. Keystone Premier Plus, she'd said, typing. That's a good plan. It is, Nyla had agreed. Then the woman's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the mouth. The kind of look people get when they have to deliver news they'd rather not be the one delivering. I'm showing this policy as suspended. Non-payment of premium as of... She squinted at the screen 48 hours ago. That's not possible, Nyla said. I have auto-pay. The system shows a failed payment and an administrative hold on the account. Then call your billing department. Call my insurance company. I have a number. Ma'am, our financial clearance team goes home at 6. It's 8:15. The contraction hit then, the 5th one in the last hour, and Nyla's hand came down on the admissions counter harder than she intended. Pen holder rattled. The clerk flinched. I'm sorry, Nyla said, straightening up, because that was who she was, a woman who apologized for her own pain when it inconvenienced other people. I'm sorry, how long are the contractions supposed to be before it becomes an emergency? I'm not able to give medical advice. You're in a hospital. I'm in admissions. The supervisor they called was a younger man named Barrett who wore his hospital ID on a lanyard decorated with cartoon coffee cups. He had clearly been trained to de-escalate. He spoke in a quiet, measured voice, and he offered to print Nyla a list of other facilities within a 15-mile radius. She looked at the list. The nearest one was 11 miles away. Her contractions were coming every 14 minutes. I need you to understand something, Nyla said, and her voice had gone to that place it went sometimes. That particular flatness that her best friend Camille called the oh-no voice, the voice that meant Nyla had moved past fear and was now operating entirely on precision. My last 2 prenatal appointments flagged elevated blood pressure. My baby is transverse. I've been admitted here twice in the past 2 months for premature contractions. This is not a low-risk situation. And she paused, because the word deliberately was sitting at the front of her mouth, and she needed to be sure before she said it. Something happened to my insurance in the last 2 days, and I need you to admit me as an emergency patient. Barrett's expression was genuinely apologetic. That was the thing that made it worse. Without active coverage, we'd require a deposit of minus. How much? He told her. Nyla stood very still. She had the money. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that she was standing in a hospital while her daughter tried to come into the world early, and the wall between her and a bed was a number that someone somewhere had decided to put there. I'll call my bank, she said. She called her bank. The automated system told her there was an unusual hold on her primary account pending a fraud review. She could dispute it by calling their main line, which had an estimated wait time of 45 to 60 minutes. She sat in one of the lobby chairs and stared at the tile floor. It was a nice floor, polished stone, pale gray, the kind of floor that cost money to install. The whole lobby cost money. The art on the walls cost money. The fountain near the entrance, an actual fountain, in a hospital lobby cost money. Someone owned all of this. She didn't know yet that she knew that person. She gathered her maternity bag and her coat, and she walked toward the exit because she wasn't going to beg. That was the one thing she had decided. Somewhere between the second trimester and the third, when the relationship was already long over, and she was doing this alone, she would not beg. The automatic doors opened. The rain came in, wet and immediate against her face, and Nyla stood on the covered walkway outside and pulled out her phone to search for rideshare availability. And the app told her there was a surge, and the nearest driver was 12 minutes away. 14 minutes between contractions. 12 minutes for a driver. She did the math. She was starting to do the math in a way that made her hands shake when she heard the doors open behind her. She didn't turn around right away. She assumed it was Barrett with a pamphlet, or a phone number, or another list of alternatives. She was already composing what she was going to say to him. Something controlled and professional when the voice came. Not Barrett's voice. A voice she had spent 3 years trying to forget. Nyla, her name in his mouth. That was the first thing. The way he said it, not as a question, not with surprise. Just her name. The way you'd say the name of a fact you already knew. The way you'd say rain when you looked out a window and saw rain. She turned around. Kwon Tae-rin was 40 years old, and he looked exactly the same. That was the obscene part. 3 years had not been kind to Nyla. Not cruelly, but honestly. The way time is honest, with people who carry things, and he stood there in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, looking like he had simply been somewhere else for a while, and now had returned. He was broader than she remembered. His jaw was harder. There were 2 men behind him, not in uniforms, not visibly armed, but something about the way they stood in relation to him communicated very clearly that their job was to exist between Tae-rin and whatever the world tried to throw at him. She hadn't known that 3 years ago. She hadn't known a lot of things. Don't, she said. Your contractions are how far apart. Don't do that. Don't make this about. The next one hit. Nyla had gotten good at managing contractions. She'd practiced. She had a whole system. The breathing, the focal point, the deliberate relaxation of the shoulders. She had practiced it alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning when the fear got bad and she needed to feel like she was doing something. The system failed her. This contraction was different. Started in the same place. The low back, but it moved, and there was a pressure beneath it that hadn't been there before, something urgent and structural, and Nyla's knees went sideways, in a way her knees had never done in 34 years of living. Tae-rin caught her. His hands. She had forgotten his hands, or tried to came around her arm and her shoulder, and he lowered her without dropping her, one knee to the ground himself, holding her weight like he'd been trained for this specific moment. I need a gurney out here, he said, not loudly. He didn't raise his voice. But the 2 men behind him moved with a speed that made it clear they had spent years learning how to respond to Tae-rin's calm directives faster than most people respond to being shouted at. Tae-rin. His name came out of her mouth before she could stop it. Can't afford, they want I know. His voice was close to her ear. I'm taking care of it. You don't get to take care of it. You don't get to show up and...
You can be angry with me.
He wasn't defensive. He wasn't apologetic, not yet. He was just stating fact. After. Be angry with me after. The gurney came through the doors. Nurses materialized. Tae-rin said something to one of the men, who turned immediately and went back inside, and then things began happening very quickly. The kind of quickly that Nyla had been trying to make happen for the last 40 minutes. She heard Tae-rin's voice in the background of the admissions process, not arguing, not threatening, simply making statements in the tone of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no and survived it. She caught fragments from the gurney. Full emergency admission. Override the financial hold. Sir, our policy— I know your policy. I own the building. Silence. Clear the maternal emergency suite. Get Dr. Choi on the phone now. Nyla stared at the ceiling tiles moving above her as the gurney rolled and thought, I own the building. She had known Tae-rin for 2 years before he disappeared. She had known he was wealthy. She had known he ran companies, multiple companies, Pacific Rim Logistics, real estate, some kind of holdings group. She had known he employed people who moved like the men behind him tonight, quietly and with purpose. She had not known he owned the hospital. She hadn't asked. That felt significant now, in the way that 100 small things feel suddenly significant when the larger truth behind them finally becomes visible. Dr. Angela Choi was 52, compact, direct in a way that felt like a gift after the last hour of Nyla's life. She had the ultrasound machine positioned and operating within 4 minutes of Nyla arriving in the suite. How long have you been having contractions? Since around 6. They were 15 minutes apart when I left home. They're closer now. Position of the baby. She was transverse at my last appointment. 3 days ago. Choi pressed the transducer and looked at the screen with an expression that gave away nothing useful. Then she looked at the 2 nurses in the room. Get me a fetal monitor. Let's talk about what we're looking at. What they were looking at was a baby who had not turned. What they were looking at was a cervix that was doing exactly what it should not be doing, given the baby's position. What they were looking at, as Choi eventually explained, in her particular brand of clinical directness that Nyla deeply appreciated, was a situation. We're going to monitor you closely. If the contractions continue at this pace, we'll need to talk about options. Options meaning a C-section. Possibly. I had a birth plan. Choi looked at her. I know. I practiced the breathing. I know. Nyla pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was not going to cry in front of this doctor whom she had met 14 minutes ago. She was simply not going to do that. Is my daughter safe right now? Right now, yes. Her heart rate is elevated, but within acceptable range. We're going to keep watching. Okay. Nyla lowered her hands. Okay. Tae-rin was in the hallway when the nurse let Nyla know she had a visitor. She had been awake for 6 hours by then. The contractions had slowed, not stopped, but slowed under observation, and the immediate terror had receded into something more manageable, a sustained low-level dread that Nyla had gotten rather expert at functioning inside of. She told the nurse she'd see him. He came in without the overcoat, jacket gone, sleeves of his dress shirt folded twice at the forearm. He looked like a different person like that, or like the person she'd actually known. The one who used to sit across from her at her kitchen table and eat the food she made, not a simple gratitude that she'd never associated with someone who apparently owned hospital buildings. He sat in the chair beside her bed without being invited, because that was also the person she'd known. The financial hold on your insurance was not an accident, he said. I know it wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. You knew before I said it. When both my insurance and my bank account developed problems on the same day, 2 days before my due date, she looked at him. Someone did that. Who did it? He held her eyes. She remembered how she used to find that quality attractive, his willingness to look at difficult things directly. Now it just meant she could see the calculation in the moment before he answered. Kang Moo-jin, he said. The name meant nothing to her. Who is he? Acting chairman of Maru Pacific Medical Group. He paused. The man who controls this hospital. You said you owned the building. I have a significant ownership stake in the holdings company. Moo-jin controls the operational side of the medical network. He said it carefully, and she could feel the edges of something larger that he was not yet saying. We've been in conflict for some time, and I got caught in the middle. No, his jaw tightened. No, you weren't caught in the middle. Targeted you specifically. She felt the room get very still. Why would a hospital chairman I've never met target me specifically? Tae-rin looked at her hands, which were resting on the edge of the hospital blanket, and then he looked back at her face. And in the 3 years since she'd last seen him, she had replayed his face in her memory, often enough to know his expressions better than she knew some of her closest friends. She knew the look he had right now. She had seen it exactly once before, on the last night, before he disappeared, and she had spent 3 years not being able to name it. She could name it now. It was the look of a man preparing to tell the truth after a very long time of not telling it. "Nyla," he said, "I need to tell you something about your father." She opened her mouth. "I never knew my father," she said carefully. "He wasn't in the picture. My mother." "Your father's name," Tae-rin said, "was Kong Seong-wook." The fetal monitor beeped steadily. The rain hit the window. Nyla Baptiste lay in a hospital bed, in a building she didn't yet know she partially owned, and listened to the name of a dead man who had secretly been her father, and the only thought she could form clearly was, how long has he known? She didn't ask it yet. She let the name settle. Kong Seong-wook. Korean. Wealthy it had to be wealthy, from the weight Tae-rin was giving it. Dead she could tell from the past tense, the slight shift in how Tae-rin held his body when he said it. "Kang," she said. "Same name as Moojin, his son." Tae-rin's voice was steady. "Moojin is Seong-wook's legitimate son." Legitimate. The word landed in her chest with a specificity that surprised her. She'd thought she'd long ago made peace with being born to a man who wasn't there. She had not anticipated how much it would cost to hear it framed that way by someone else. "And I'm the other kind," she said. "You're his daughter," Tae-rin said. Just that. No modifier. Another contraction began, lower and slower than the recent ones, and Nyla breathed through it and kept her eyes on Tae-rin's face and waited for it to pass. And when it did, she said, "How long have you known who my father was?" He didn't look away. She would always give him that much. "Since before I met you," he said. He didn't tell her everything that night. She didn't ask for everything that night. What she asked for was the part that mattered to the woman lying in a hospital bed, waiting for her daughter to decide when she was ready to enter the world. He told her that Seong-wook had asked him to find her, that the old man had been dying, had carried the secret of Nyla's existence for decades, and in the end had wanted to know that she was safe without having the courage to tell her the truth himself. He told her he had been supposed to observe and report. He told her it hadn't gone that way. "You fell in love with me," she said. Not asking. Yes, while knowing I was your dying employer's secret daughter. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "And when he died," she said, "what happened when he died?" "He left you half his empire." Tae-rin kept his eyes on her. 42% of Maru Pacific Holdings. Moojin found out. "He came after everything, my businesses, my people, and he promised he would come after you if I didn't hand over the documents proving the inheritance." He paused. "I chose not to hand them over, so you disappeared instead. I thought I was protecting you." She turned her face toward the window then, because she needed a moment where he couldn't read her. The rain was still doing what rain in Seattle does in November. Patient, accumulative. It got into everything. She had built a life in the absence of his. She had rebuilt her credit and managed her portfolios and grown a child alone in a one-bedroom apartment and practiced her breathing and gone to the birthing class without a partner and written everything down. And the whole time he had known who she was, and her father had known where she was. And Moojin had been quietly, systematically, from a distance doing something to her. She didn't know the full shape of it yet, but the insurance, the bank account. She was already reaching back through the last 3 years for the other moments when something had gone sideways for reasons she couldn't explain. Contract collapse 2 years ago. The credit anomalies. The job offer from a firm in Portland that was pulled 3 days after it was made. How long had Moojin been working on her without her knowing? She turned back from the window. "He knew about me," she said. Moojin. He found out after Seong-wook died. And what has he been doing for the last 3 years? Tae-rin looked at her, and the calculation she'd seen in his face earlier was gone. What replaced it was something she didn't have a word for. Something raw and tired, and she thought ashamed. Making sure you stayed small, he said. So you could never claim what Seong-wook left you. The fetal monitor beeped. Nyla Baptiste closed her eyes. She pressed her hands flat against the blanket over her daughter, who was still transverse, still deciding, still entirely unaware of the inheritance, waiting outside the walls of this room, and thought about all the different ways men had loved her badly, with the best intentions. When she opened her eyes, Tae-rin was still there. Get out, she said quietly. Not forever, just tonight. I can't process you and this at the same time. He stood, he didn't argue. That surprised her. He walked to the door and stopped. The doctor says the contractions may restart, he said. I'll be in the building. I know, she said. You own it. He left. Nyla lay in the silence of the room and listened to her daughter's heartbeat on the monitor and thought about a man named Kang Seong-wook, who had planted a garden he apparently wanted her to see someday, and a man named Moo Jin, who had tried to erase her from the earth, and a man named Tae-rin who had loved her and left her and come back on the worst night of her life and caught her before she hit the ground. None of them had asked what she wanted. None of them had given her the chance to choose. That was the thing she kept returning to, in the hours before the contractions restarted, at 3 in the morning more intense than before, and Dr. Choi came back in with the expression that meant we need to talk about those options now. Not the inheritance, not the money, not even Tae-rin. The fact that her whole life, the shape of it, the limits of it, the losses in it, had been arranged by people who told themselves they were protecting her. And not one of them had ever once sat down across from her and said, here is the truth. What do you want to do? The contractions came back hard at 3:17 Dr. Choi said umbilical cord. She said, we need to go now. 41 minutes later, Nyla was in surgery. 11 minutes after that, she heard nothing. 40 seconds passed, the longest 40 seconds of her life. And then her daughter screamed. And Nyla Baptiste, who had managed $40 million portfolios and rebuilt her credit and practiced her breathing alone at 2 in the morning and gone to the birthing class with a notepad instead of a partner, Nyla Baptiste came apart completely. Not in grief. In relief so total it felt like being put back together from the inside. Amara, she thought. Her name is Amara. On the other side of the surgical glass, in a hallway where he had no right to be, and no one had told him to go, Kwon Tae-rin stood, with his hands clasped, and his head down and his eyes wet for the first time, in longer than he could accurately remember. He had not been invited. He could not stay away. Some things about him had not changed. Some things, over the weeks and months ahead, would have to. Amara Baptiste was 11 hours old when the nurse brought her to Nyla for the second time, and Nyla still hadn't figured out how to hold her without feeling like she was going to break something. Not the baby, herself. The C-section incision pulled every time she shifted position. The pain medication they'd given her was good enough to take the edge off, and not good enough to make her stop noticing the edge. She was propped up against 2 pillows in the maternal recovery suite, a nicer room than she'd been in during either of her previous admissions, a detail she was choosing not to think about too hard, and Amara was making the small clicking sounds that newborns make, the sounds that meant nothing was wrong. And Nyla was staring at the top of her daughter's head, like it contained an answer to a question she hadn't finished forming yet. Her phone had 14 unread messages. Camille had called 4 times. Her obgyn back at her regular clinic had left a voicemail expressing concern. There were 2 numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't touch the phone. The door opened without a knock. Nyla looked up, and the man who walked in was not Tae-rin. He was around 50. With the particular kind of grooming that announces money without appearing to try. His suit was charcoal, his tie a muted burgundy, and he carried himself the way people carry themselves when they have spent their entire lives being the most important person in any room they enter. He had Seong-wook's jaw. She didn't know that yet, wouldn't know it for another 24 hours, but something about the structure of his face registered in the back of her mind as familiar in a way she couldn't locate. He stopped at a respectful distance from the bed. Mr. Baptiste. His English was precise and nearly unaccented. I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Kong Moo Jin. I'm the acting chairman of Miriu Pacific Medical Group. He paused, and the pause was calibrated. I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced during your admission last night. Nyla looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at financial statements when something didn't add up. Not with suspicion, exactly, but with the specific kind of attention that is already searching for the discrepancy. Inconvenience, she said. There was an administrative error in our billing coordination system. These things happen more often than we'd like. I've instructed my team to ensure your account is fully reinstated and that there will be no financial burden to you during your recovery or your daughter's observation period. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and almost warm. Again, my sincere apologies. Amara made a small sound against Nyla's chest. Nyla didn't look down at her daughter. She kept her eyes on Mujin. An administrative error, she said. That's correct. My premium payments are on autopay through a dedicated account. That account has had the same bank routing information for 2 years. She kept her voice level. At the same time your system registered my policy as suspended, my primary bank account developed a fraud hold. Both things on the same day, 48 hours before my due date. Mujin's smile didn't move. That was interesting. Most people, when caught in something, show it in the smile first. A fraction of a second of recalibration. His didn't move at all. Coincidences do occur, he said. They do, Nyla agreed. They occur less often in patterns. Something passed across his eyes, fast and gone. I understand your concern. The stress of what you went through last night, especially given the nature of your delivery. He glanced at Amara with what appeared to be genuine softness. It would make anyone look for reasons. I'm not looking for reasons, Nyla said. I already have reasons. I'm looking for confirmation. He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that this man was very good at this. The second was that he knew, she knew, and he had come here anyway, and that meant he was either supremely confident or he was here to measure something. She thought it was probably both. I hope you and your daughter recover quickly, he said. If there is anything the hospital can do to make your stay more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. He produced a business card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the bedside table, precisely with 2 fingers. My direct line. He turned to go, Mr. Kang. Her voice stopped him at the door. He turned back. Before you go, there's something Tae-rin hasn't told me yet. You implied that last night, in the lobby. Whatever it is, I'll find out eventually. I always do. She looked at him. You might want to factor that into whatever you're planning next. His expression didn't change. Good morning, Ms. Baptiste, he said. He left. Nyla sat in the silence for a full minute. Amara shifted against her chest, and Nyla finally looked down at her daughter, at the compressed ancient face of a person who had been alive for less than half a day and already had no idea what she'd been born into. I know, Nyla said quietly. I don't know what we're in either. Tae-rin arrived 40 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that he'd clearly gotten from somewhere that was not a hospital vending machine because they were in paper cups from an actual cafe, which meant someone on his staff had been sent out specifically. He held one out to her without saying anything, because he still remembered how she took it black, no sugar, and that small specific thing made her angrier than almost anything else. He was here, she said, taking the cup. Tae-rin went still. Mujin. He called it an administrative error. He came to your room. It wasn't a question. His voice had gone to a particular register that she recognized from a handful of moments in the 2 years she'd known him. The register that meant something was happening underneath the surface, that he was working very hard to keep from reaching his face. He looked at Amara. While I was holding my 11-hour-old daughter, yes. He set his coffee down on the windowsill and turned partially away from her, and she watched his profile and the slight movement in his jaw that meant he was doing calculations she wasn't supposed to see. He's sending a message, he said. He's been sending messages for 3 years. I just didn't know they were from him. She put her cup down, too. I want to know everything now. Not tonight. Not when I'm stronger. Now. He turned back. He looked at Amara again, and something moved across his face that she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to interpret right now. It'll take a while, he said. Then sit down, she said, and start talking. His name was Kang Song-wook, and he had built an empire starting in Seoul in the 1970s before anyone was calling the Korean economic expansion a miracle. Shipping first, then logistics, then the kind of investments that follow, when you have enough money that your money starts making its own decisions. By the time Song-wook was 40, he controlled a network of companies that had quietly embedded themselves into both legitimate Pacific Rim commerce and the shadow economy that ran alongside it. He was also, by any measure, a hard man. The kind of man who built things by understanding exactly what other people needed and exactly how much pain they could endure and calibrating his actions accordingly. He fell in love once. He had not been particularly kind about it. Nyla Baptiste had been 26 and living in Seoul on a 12-month teaching contract when she met Sung-wook at a business dinner she hadn't expected to attend. She'd gone because a colleague canceled and someone needed to fill the seat. Song-wook had seated himself next to her deliberately because his English was better than he admitted, and she was the only person in the room who said something that surprised him. What began as curiosity on his side became, over 8 months, the closest thing to genuine vulnerability Song-wook had ever permitted himself. His family refused the relationship, not subtly loudly, with the specific force of a wealthy Korean family in the early 1990s for whom a Black American woman represented every possible category of wrong. He was already engaged to someone acceptable. He was expected to produce a certain kind of heir. He chose the acceptable engagement. Danielle went home. She didn't know she was pregnant until she was back in Chicago. Song-wook didn't know about Nyla until Danielle, dying of a stroke 8 years later, sent us a letter to the only Seoul address she still had for him. By then, Moojin was 12 years old and Haewon was 9, and Song-wook's acceptable marriage had produced exactly the legitimate family his family had demanded. He read the letter. He did nothing. Not because he didn't care. That was the part that Tae-rin said with the particular heaviness, the part that he seemed to be choosing words around with care. Not because he didn't care, because he was a man who had spent his entire life controlling his circumstances, and an 8-year-old daughter in Chicago was something he could not control without destroying everything else he had built. So he watched, periodically, at a distance through people whose discretion he trusted. He watched Nyla go through the foster system after Danielle died. Watched her age out. Watched her put herself through community college and then through a 4-year program and then into a finance career built entirely from stubbornness and competence. Told himself he was making sure she was safe. That's what men like him call it, Nyla said. Her voice had not changed volume. That was the thing that told Tae-rin how deep this was landing. She wasn't getting louder. She was getting quieter. Call it protecting. What it actually is watching someone suffer from a safe distance and deciding your comfort matters more than their truth. Tae-rin was quiet. Keep going, she said. He kept going. Song-wook was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. In his last months, the calculus of his conscience shifted. He summoned Tae-rin, who was then a rising figure in the operational side of the Maru Syndicate, the shadow infrastructure that Song-wook had built alongside his legitimate empire, and that he now wanted to matter less than it did. He told Tae-rin the truth, all of it. He gave him a name and a city and a photograph from the surveillance reports he'd kept, and he asked Tae-rin to find Nyla once more. Not to interfere, not to reveal himself, simply to look at her and come back and say whether she was safe. And you said yes, Nyla said. I said yes, because he was your boss. Tae-rin looked at her steadily, because he was dying and he asked me. She absorbed that. It was important to be accurate about this. Tae-rin had done a lot of things wrong, and she was not going to let the genuine parts excuse the calculated ones. But she was also not going to flatten this into something simpler than it was, because she had always had an allergy to dishonesty, including in the stories, she told herself. You went to Chicago, she said. You'd moved to Seattle 2 years before. I followed the current address, and then I found you. He paused. I was going to watch you for a week and go back. But you got into an argument with a parking enforcement officer on 3rd Avenue about a ticket that was genuinely the city's fault, and you had printed documentation to prove it. And you stood there in the rain making your case for 22 minutes until the officer called his supervisor. Something crossed Tae-rin's face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I stood across the street and watched you make your case to the supervisor for another 9 minutes. I remember that ticket, Nyla said. I won. I know. I watched you win. He looked at his hands. I went back to my hotel and I told myself I was going to file my report and leave. I stayed another week, then another. When did you tell Song-wook you were staying? I didn't. Not for 2 months. He looked up at her. By then we had met. Do you remember? She remembered. Mutual friend. A dinner that was supposed to be 6 people and became 8 because someone brought someone. She had been tired and a little underdressed, and she'd sat down next to a man who was making quiet conversation with the person on his left, and who turned to her and said, without any preamble, "You look like you'd rather be somewhere else." And she had said, "Is it that obvious?" And he had said only to me, and she had thought at the time that it was a good line, but not necessarily sincere. It had been sincere. That was the particular cruelty of it. A sound she'd seen she could see back now with the information she had. She could see every moment that she'd second-guessed every time she'd told herself she was probably projecting, and understand that she hadn't been projecting. It had been real. His feelings had been real. The deception and the real feelings had coexisted inside him for 2 years, without one canceling the other out. She didn't know what to do with that. When Seong-wook died, she said, "Walk me through exactly what happened." He did. The sealed estate documents were opened 6 weeks after Seong-wook's death. His will was precise and detailed, and had been prepared by a different legal team than the one his family used, specifically to prevent interference at the drafting stage. The documents named Nyla and provided DNA evidence linking her to Seong-wook. The inheritance was specific, 42% of Maru Pacific Holdings, including equity interests in 7 subsidiary companies. Moojin received notification simultaneously. Within 72 hours, he had contacted Tae-rin. Conversation, as Tae-rin described it, was brief and not particularly subtle. He said, "Give me the original documents and I'll let everything you've built stay standing." Tae's voice was flat when he described this part. Flat in a way that meant he was keeping something controlled. He said if the inheritance was established, the investigation into Maru Pacific Holdings would expose the shadow infrastructure Seong-wook built, which would expose me. He said he'd hand everything he knew about my operations directly to the FBI. Would he have done it? Yes. But you didn't give him the documents. No. Why not? Tae-rin looked at her directly. Because they were yours. I sat with that for a long moment. The pain medication was wearing off, and the incision was making itself known, a low, insistent throbbing that she breathed through without mentioning. "And you decided," she said carefully, "that the best way to protect me was to leave. Without telling me why. Without telling me who I was. Without giving me the option to make a different choice. You would have fought him. Yes. He would have destroyed you. Maybe." She looked at him. "But that was my call to make. Not yours." He didn't flinch. She had to give him credit for that. He sat with it. "I know that now," he said. "You knew it then," she said. "You chose differently." He didn't deny it. Attorney Elias Van Mercer arrived the following afternoon. He was 46, black, and had the kind of build and the kind of suits that communicated simultaneously, that he worked very hard and that he expected to be taken seriously. He'd been Tae-rin's attorney for 8 years, on the legitimate side of things, which Nyla had decided to hold as a separate question from everything else for the time being, because there were only so many things she could process simultaneously while recovering from major surgery and caring for a newborn. Elias spread 3 documents on the adjustable tray table over Nyla's bed with the careful precision of a man who understood that paper could be more dangerous than weapons if handled correctly. "The will is ironclad," he said. "Seong-wook used a firm out of Vancouver that has no existing relationship with any Kang family interests. The DNA evidence was collected and certified through a lab in Switzerland. The documents establishing Maru Pacific Holdings' ownership structure are registered in 3 separate jurisdictions." He tapped the first document. 42%. "Your name, properly transliterated from Nyla Baptiste's birth registration, is in the primary beneficiary clause. Nyla looked at the documents. She had read financial instruments for a living. She knew what she was looking at. He challenges the will, she said. Mu-jin, already filed. Elias did it without particular alarm, which she appreciated. His legal team is arguing that Song-wook was not mentally competent at the time of signing due to the progression of his illness. They're requesting access to his medical records. Are there medical records that support the challenge? Elias and Tae-rin exchanged a look that lasted about 1 second too long. There are medical records that Mu-jin has produced. Elias said that purport to show cognitive decline. Purport to show, Nyla repeated. Yes. Meaning? Meaning, I'd like to have a neurologist examine them before I characterize them more specifically than that. Tae-rin shifted in the chair near the window. Nyla watched him. She said, what do you have? He looked at Elias. Don't look at him, Nyla said. Look at me. What do you have? Song-wook's actual medical records. The originals. His primary care physician in Seoul transferred care to a team here during the last 18 months of his life, and I have the complete file from both teams. The genuine file. He paused. It shows no cognitive impairment. He was physically deteriorating rapidly at the end, but his cognition was entirely intact when the documents were signed. His attending physician was present at the signing specifically to certify that. So Mu-jin fabricated the records he submitted. The records Mu-jin submitted contain dates and signatures that I believe can be demonstrated to be. Tae-rin chose the word carefully, inconsistent with the actual timeline. Forged, Nyla said. That's the word. Yes. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Her daughter was in the nursery for the next 2 hours because a nurse had firmly and correctly insisted that Nyla sleep. And Nyla had not slept, but she had gotten an hour and a half of horizontal stillness, which was going to have to be good enough. If you use those records, she said, if you hand them to Elias and he submits them as evidence, what does Mu-jin do? He escalates, Tae-rin said. To what? To things that move outside of courtrooms. She turned her head to look at him directly. Say what you mean. He will come after my businesses, my people, the individuals who work for me in ways that... He stopped. There are people whose livelihoods depend on the organizations I run. If Mu-jin triggers a certain kind of investigation, those people get caught in it. And the threat he made, about handing information to the FBI, that's still on the table, so using the real medical records to defend the inheritance puts your people at risk. Potentially, yes. And not using them means the inheritance gets buried under a fraudulent competency claim. Also, yes. Nyla closed her eyes for a moment. She had grown up without money. She had grown up without family in any functional sense of the word. She had built everything she had from the ground up with her own hands and her own mind, and she had told herself for years that she didn't need what she hadn't been given. 42% of a multi-billion-dollar holdings company was not something she needed. But Mu-jin had also sat in this room and looked her in the face and called nearly killing her an administrative error. And 2 days before Amara was born, he had made a phone call, and that phone call had left a high-risk pregnant woman standing outside an emergency room in November rain. She opened her eyes. This is what I want to know, she said. Not what you think is safest. Not what you've already decided. What do I have the right to know that I still don't know? Tae-rin and Elias looked at each other again. This time Nyla let the look happen, because she wanted to see what came after it. What came after it was Elias opening his briefcase and removing a folder that he held for a moment, as though making a final decision about something, and then setting it on the table in front of her. Mu-jin's legal team isn't his only play, Elias said. 3 days ago, we became aware of, he paused over the word, duplication suggesting a pattern of activity directed at you over the past 3 years. Nyla didn't touch the folder yet. What kind of activity, she said. Credit interference, professional references that were modified. A contract termination in 2023 that may not have been the result of budget cuts. He looked at her steadily. The insurance suspension was not Mu-jin's first move. It was his most recent one. The room was very quiet. How long? Nyla said. The earliest instance we can identify is approximately 3 months after Song-wook's estate was opened. 3 years, she said. He's been doing this for 3 years. The evidence suggests a sustained effort to prevent you from accumulating the professional standing or financial stability that would make an inheritance claim credible. She thought about the Portland job offer, the contract collapse, the credit anomalies that she'd attributed to the chaos of a difficult year and fixed painstakingly over 18 months. She thought about all the doors that had opened and then quietly, inexplicably closed. She thought about how competent she'd believed herself to be and wondered now how much higher she might have climbed on a level surface. Then she stopped that thought because it was a thought that would eat her alive if she let it, and she needed to be operational right now. "Elias," she said, "if I instruct you to pursue this, the inheritance, the competency challenge, all of it, what does the timeline look like?" 18 months minimum if Moojin fights it fully. Possibly 3 years. And if we have evidence of the sabotage. Credit interference, the contract termination. It changes the posture significantly. We'd be in a position to make counterclaims. Potentially involve regulatory bodies. He paused. It would also accelerate Moojin's response. She looked at Tae-rin. "You've been holding those records for 3 years," she said. "Protecting them. From Moojin." "Yes. You did that knowing it put your business at risk." "Yes. But you didn't come to me. You didn't tell me what you had. You just held them." He met her eyes. "I thought I was protecting me." She said it for him. "I know you were protecting me." She held his gaze. "Do you understand why that is almost as much of a problem as what Moojin did?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm starting to," he said. "Tae-rin." Her voice was steady, which was costing her. "I am 34 years old. I survived a system that failed me from birth. I rebuilt my finances after someone I didn't know was quietly dismantling them. I just had major surgery, and I have a 12-hour-old daughter in the nursery down the hall who has no father and no grandfather, and a family she doesn't know yet." She stopped. "I don't need protection. I need the truth, and I need to be the one who decides what I do with it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "The records," he said. "I'll give them to Elias today. Whatever it costs." She waited for the but. There wasn't one. That surprised her more than anything else he'd said. "There's something else," Elias said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, but Nyla had gotten very good at reading the small changes. "Say it," she said. "We received something this morning." Through a back channel, he reached into the folder and removed a single sheet. From inside the Kang family, he passed it to her. It was an email chain, printed. The addresses were internal Maru Pacific addresses. The dates ran from 8 months ago to 3 weeks before Amara's birth. She read the first 3 lines. Then she put the sheet face down on the tray table because she needed a moment before she read the rest. Because the third line referenced the specific name and policy number of her insurance plan and included the words "accelerate the suspension timeline" and was signed with Moojin's internal authorization code. "Who sent this to you?" she said. Elias glanced at Tae-rin. "Someone inside the Kang family," Tae-rin said carefully, "who has decided that Moojin has gone further than she intended." Nyla picked up the sheet again. She read the entire chain. The last email in the chain was dated 18 days before Amara was born. Confirmed the authorization. It had Moojin's digital signature. And in the bottom right corner, in the metadata that most people never looked at because most people didn't know it existed, was a secondary internal forwarding address that had automatically copied a third party on the exchange. The name on the forwarding address was Kong Hae-won. Nyla set the paper down. "He has a sister," she said. "Yes," Tae-rin said, "and she's been copying herself on his communications." "It appears so." Why, Tae-rin was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said finally, "I think she suspected what her brother was doing, and she wanted proof. In case she ever needed it." Nyla looked at the sheet on the tray table. A sister she didn't know existed had been quietly collecting evidence of a brother's crimes, and had now sent that evidence to an attorney she had no direct relationship with, through a back channel 3 days after the night that almost killed Nyla's daughter. Something about this woman's particular kind of courage, the private kind, the kind that operates without an audience and without certainty moved through Nyla in a way she wasn't prepared for. I want to meet her, Nyla said. That may be complicated, Tae-rin said. Most things are. She looked at him. Set it up. He nodded. Elias began gathering the documents. Nyla watched him and thought about the email chain and about the insurance suspension and about 3 years of doors quietly closing and about Mu-jin sitting in this room that morning with his calibrated smile and his business card placed precisely with 2 fingers. He had come to measure her. She understood that now. He'd wanted to know whether she was going to be a problem. She picked up the business card from the bedside table and turned it over in her fingers. She thought about what she'd said to him before he left. I always find out eventually. She set the card back down. Not as a dismissal, as a bookmark. Because the person who had walked into this hospital 2 nights ago, the woman with the maternity bag and the failed insurance card and the contractions coming too fast, that woman had known something was wrong but hadn't known what or who or how deep it went. She knew now. 42% of an empire that had been deliberately kept from her. A father who had watched her from a safe distance and called it love. A man who had loved her genuinely and lied to her completely. A brother she'd never met who had spent 3 years quietly trying to make sure she never became someone who could threaten him. And a sister who had been watching all of it and saving the receipts. Nyla looked at the window. The rain was still there. In Seattle in November, the rain was always still there. One more thing, she said. Elias paused. Mu-jin said Tae-rin hadn't told me everything. He said it deliberately, in front of Tae-rin, before he left. She didn't look at Tae-rin when she said this. She kept her eyes on Elias. Is there something in those documents, in the original estate filing, that I haven't been told yet? The silence lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds was long enough. Elias, she said. There is a condition in the estate filing, Elias said. A secondary clause that Seong-wook included alongside the inheritance provision. What does it say? Elias looked at Tae-rin. Don't, Nyla said quietly. Don't look at him. He doesn't get to decide what I hear anymore. What does the clause say? Elias straightened his papers. It says, he said, that Tae-rin Kwon is named as the designated trustee of Nyla Baptiste's inheritance, with full authority to manage and protect the estate interest on her behalf, until such time as she formally asserts her claim. He paused. Seong-wook gave Tae-rin legal authority over your inheritance, Nyla. He has had that authority for 3 years. Every decision Tae-rin has made about those documents, what to hold, what to protect, when to act, he made as the legally designated trustee of assets that belong to you. The fetal monitor in the next room was audible through the wall. Nyla sat very still. Seong-wook had not asked Tae-rin to find her. He had appointed him. He had given a man who then fell in love with her legal authority over her financial future, without telling either of them the full picture. And Tae-rin had accepted that authority and exercised it for 3 years and disappeared from her life to protect documents that he was legally entitled to manage on her behalf. Every choice Tae-rin had made was, in a narrow and devastating legal sense, within his authority. She finally looked at him. He was looking at the floor. He knew this was the thing. He had known the whole time that this was the thing. Not just the deception, not just the disappearance. The fact that even his love for her had operated within a framework of authority that someone else had constructed without her knowledge or consent. Get out, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Both of you, she said. I need to see my daughter. Amara slept through most of it. That was the thing Nyla kept coming back to in the hours after Elias and Tae-rin left the room. Her daughter, 3 days old, slept with the total commitment of someone who had not yet learned that the world required vigilance. She slept in the crook of Nyla's arm while Nyla stared at the ceiling and did the thing she always did when something broke open inside her. She made a list. Not on paper. In her head the way she'd learned to do when she was 14, and living in a group home, and paper had a way of disappearing. What she knew, Seong-wook had been her father. He had watched her from a distance for 26 years and called it protection. He had died and left her 42% of an empire, and appointed the man she loved as the legal trustee of that inheritance without telling either of them the full picture. Moojin had spent 3 years systematically dismantling her professional life to prevent her from ever becoming someone credible enough to threaten him. The insurance cancellation was documented. The forged medical records were documented. A woman named Kang Hae-won had been quietly collecting evidence of her brother's crimes and had now forwarded that evidence to Aslias through a back channel. Now, what she didn't know, why Hae-won had waited, what Hae-won wanted, what Moojin's next move looked like now that he'd come to her room and taken her measure, and what was in the estate documents that Elias had still been careful around, even after revealing the trustee clause, because Nyla had spent enough years reading financial instruments to know when someone was being precise in a way designed to avoid a larger truth. Amara made a small sound in her sleep, and Nyla looked down at her. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm working on it." She asked to see Hae-won first, not Tae-rin, not Elias. Not the hospital's patient advocate, who had left 3 voicemails, or the billing supervisor, who apparently wanted to personally confirm that Nyla's account had been fully reinstated, as if the paperwork was the part she was thinking about. She asked the nurse to send a message through Tae-rin's office, because that was the channel available to her, which itself a problem she was cataloging for later, that she would like to meet with Kang Hae-won at her earliest convenience, and that she would prefer the meeting to happen without Tae-rin or Elias present. The response came back in 40 minutes. Hae-won would come at 2. She came at 1:50, which told Nyla something. Kang Hae-won was 37, 3 years younger than Nyla, and she had the bone structure from someone whose genetics had been kind to them, but who had spent enough years under pressure that the kindness was getting harder to see. She was dressed simply dark slacks, a cream blouse, minimal jewelry, and she moved into the room with a quietness that felt deliberate, like someone who had spent a long time learning how to take up less space than they actually occupied. She stopped just inside the door and looked at Nyla with an expression that Nyla could not immediately categorize. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It wasn't pity. It was something more complicated, the look of someone who had been carrying a thing for a long time and was not yet sure whether putting it down would feel like relief or collapse. "You're taller than I thought," Hae-won said. Her English was very good, accented, careful. "You thought about what I'd look like?" Nyla said. "I looked you up. After I found out," she paused, 2.5 years ago. Nyla absorbed that. "You've known about me for 2.5 years. I found a reference in my father's personal files after he died. A name, a city." Hae-won's jaw moved slightly. "It took me 4 months to understand what I was looking at, and another 2 years to send that email chain to my attorney." Hae-won didn't flinch. "Yes. Why now?" Hae-won looked at the bassinet where Amara was sleeping and then looked back at Nyla. "Because of what he did," she said. "The insurance. I knew he was interfering with your professional life. I told myself it was—" She stopped. "I told myself it was a dispute between adults. Money, inheritance, those things can be contested. People fight over what their parents leave behind. That's not—" She stopped again. "But what he did with the insurance. You were pregnant. You were—" Her voice caught on something. "You were our father's daughter, and he tried to leave you outside." She said it plainly, without drama, and that plainness was what made it land. "Sit down," Nyla said. Hae-won sat. "What do you want?" Nyla said. Not unkindly, directly. "I want my brother to stop," Hae-won said. "I want what my father intended to happen. And I want—" She looked at her hands for a moment. I want to know if there is a version of this where I don't lose everything I have left of my family." Nyla looked at her. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the fact that she had been born into this family and excluded from it. Simultaneously, that Hae-won had grown up inside, something Nyla had been kept outside of, that their positions were not equivalent and never would be. She thought about the specific kind of loneliness of watching someone in your own family do something unconscionable and having to decide every day what that meant about your own culpability. "I don't know yet," Nyla said honestly, "but I'm not interested in destroying things that don't need destroying." Something in Hae-won's face shifted. "Tell me about the email chain," Nyla said. "All of it, not just what you sent." Hae-won had started copying herself on Moojin's internal communications 14 months ago. "Not all of them." She didn't have access to all of them. But Maru Pacific Medical Group's internal system had an administrative oversight function that board members could access for compliance purposes, and Haewon was a board member, which was one of the few concrete things Seong-wook had given his legitimate daughter before EC died at the table, but not enough votes to actually control what happened there. She had used the oversight function carefully, periodically, never in a pattern that would flag. She had watched Moojin build a paper trail of interference. The credit reporting manipulation, that one had required an outside contractor, someone Moojin had paid through a subsidiary, and the payment authorization had gone through the medical group's accounts for a single quarter before Moojin apparently realized the risk and rerouted it. Hay had the payment record, the professional reference modification, a letter sent under the name of a former Maru Pacific executive to the Portland firm, subtly undermining Nyla's qualifications. Haewon had the draft version, with Moojin's tracked changes still visible in the document metadata. And the insurance suspension, which had been clean and direct and documented in the email chain she'd already sent, authorized personally by Moojin, with a timeline and a specific instruction to ensure the suspension could not be reversed through standard customer service channels. Nyla listened to all of it without interrupting. When Haewon finished, the room was quiet for a moment. He knew I was pregnant when he authorized the suspension, Nyla said. Email chain references your admission history, Haewon said quietly. He knew. Nyla pressed her lips together. There was a version of this moment where she let herself feel the full force of what that meant. A man knowing she was 35 weeks pregnant and high risk and authorizing the cancellation of her insurance anyway. Knowing she would come to his hospital because it was the closest one, knowing she would be turned away. There was a version where she let that feeling do what feelings like that want to do. She didn't go there, not yet. Elias needs all of it, she said. Everything you have, not just the chain you already sent. Every document, every payment record, every draft with metadata intact. I know. Haewon reached into her bag and produced a flash drive. I brought it. Nyla looked at the drive. She looked at this woman she'd never met, who shared her blood but not her history, who had spent 14 months quietly building an evidentiary case against her own brother and had chosen this moment to hand it over. Why didn't you just go to the police? Nyla said. Because going to the police with evidence of Moojin's interference would also surface questions about the Maru Cincy syndicate, Haewon said, which would involve Tae-rin. She paused. My father built the syndicate. Whatever Moojin is, he didn't build that. My father did. I don't want my father's name destroyed. Your father's name, Nyla said. Not mine. The words landed between them. Haewon held her gaze. Our father's name, she said, correcting herself with some effort. I'm still working on that, so am I, Nyla said. She took the flash drive. Elias called at 4 that afternoon. Nyla had sent him the drive through a nurse, with a brief note that said, call me when you've looked at it. He stopped. Nyla, this is substantial. I know. The payment record for the credit manipulation alone is, with the right forensic accountant, we can tie this directly to Moojin's personal authorization. What does it do to the competency challenge? It reframes everything. Moojin's argument is that your inheritance claim is invalid because Seong-wook was incompetent. But if we can demonstrate that Moojin has been engaged in a multi-year fraudulent campaign to suppress a legitimate heir's ability to make a claim. Elias paused, and she could hear him choosing his words. It suggests his challenge is not a good-faith legal dispute. It's the continuation of the same campaign. Judges notice that. What do we need from Tae-rin's records? The original medical file. The one showing Seong-wook's genuine cognitive status. Get it from him today, Nyla said. Whatever he needs to hand it over, make it happen today. There's a complication. Her jaw tightened slightly. Of course there is. Moojin's team filed a motion this morning to compel production of any estate-related documents held by third parties. That means Tae-rin. He paused. They filed it at 9 a.m. Which means they filed it before Moojin came to your room. She sat with that. Moojin had been in her room at 10. He had come in knowing that his legal team had already made the move to legally force Tae-rin's hand. He had come to be polite, to be regretful, to see whether Nyla knew. She hadn't known then, she knew now. Can Tae-rin voluntarily produce the documents before the motion is heard, she said. If he moves fast enough. Elias paused. There's a window. Possibly. If he files a voluntary disclosure before the court processes the compulsion motion, it changes the posture significantly. He's not complying under order. He's acting as a trustee, fulfilling his fiduciary obligation. How long is the window? 48 hours. Maybe less. Get Tae-rin on the phone, she said. Right now, conference call. All three of us. Nyla, I know I'm still in the hospital. I know I'm 3 days post-surgery. Get him on the phone. The call lasted 22 minutes. Tae-rin agreed to voluntary disclosure before Elias finished explaining why it was the better option. It became clear, ahead of the legal question, he'd had his own attorney working on the problem since the morning. He just hadn't told Nyla yet. She noted this without comment during the call. She brought it up afterward when Elias had disconnected and it was just Tae-rin on the line. You already knew about the motion, she said. I found out at 10 this morning. You came to see me at 11. A pause, yes. And you didn't mention it. I was trying to determine the best approach before Meitzen. Tae-rin. She kept her voice even. I am going to say this once, and I need you to hear it as the thing I actually mean, and not as an opening position in a conversation. Every single time you decide to determine the best approach before you bring me information that directly concerns me, you are making the same choice you made 3 years ago. You are deciding that your judgment about what I should know and when matters more than my right to have the information. Do you understand what I'm saying? The silence was longer this time. Yes, he said. Good, she said now. Is there anything else you know that you haven't told me yet? Another pause. Something in that pause. Tae-rin. There's something I need to show you in person, he said. Not over the phone. Then come to the hospital. It's not, I need to bring something. A document. It was in Seong-wook's personal files, separate from the estate documents. I found it 6 months ago. 6 months ago. 6 months ago she had been in her second trimester, managing her caseload from home 3 days a week, waking up at 2 in the morning to practice her breathing. What is it, she said. A letter, he said, to you. From Seong-wook. The word to you landed somewhere behind her sternum. Bring it, she said. Now. He arrived in 30 minutes with the letter in a plain envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax that had been broken and repressed. She could see the seam. He had opened it. He had read it. He set it on the tray table in front of her and sat down without speaking. She looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in Korean on the top line, and in English beneath it, Nyla Baptiste. In the handwriting of an elderly man who had been losing physical strength when he wrote it, because the letters were careful in the way that handwriting gets careful when the hand is tired, and the person knows this may be among their last. She picked it up. She read it. It was not long. 2 pages, both sides of a single folded sheet, in English that was formal and slightly stiff in the way of someone who had learned the language as an adult through business rather than intimacy. He did not begin with Dear Nyla. He began with her name alone, the way Tae-rin had said it outside the hospital as a fact, rather than an address. He told her about Danielle. He told it plainly, without making himself sympathetic, which she noticed, Sistis, and which cost her something she hadn't expected to spend. He said he had been a man who chose safety over courage, and had lived with that choice, and had told himself many times that the distance was protection, and had known for at least 20 of those years that it was not. He told her he had watched her. He said watching her was the thing he was most ashamed of, not because he'd done it, but because he'd done it instead of the harder thing. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said he did not think he was owed it. He said he had one wish that was so small it embarrassed him to write it, given everything, and that was that she might someday see the garden he had planted at the waterfront estate, because he had planted it thinking of her, and it had never been for anyone else. He signed it with his name only, not your father, not with love. Just his name. Nyla put the letter down. She sat very still. Tae-rin was watching her with the look of a man who had read this letter himself and had been sit with what it meant for 6 months, and she thought about that about him, reading these words and carrying them and deciding, again, that he would determine the right time to give them to her. She was going to have to find a way to not let that be the thing she focused on right now, because there were more immediate problems, and because grief and anger were not the same thing, and this moment called for something closer to the first. He planted the garden thinking of me, she said, yes. But he never told me it existed. No. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the bedside table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Tae-rin. You've had this for 6 months, she said. Yes. She was already alive, Nyla said Amara. I was already pregnant. You knew who I was. You had this letter, and you had known for years that I was Seong-wook's daughter, and you still didn't come to me. I was afraid, he said. She had expected a more complicated answer. The simplicity of it stopped her. Of what, she said. That you'd use the letter to find the estate documents on your own, he said. That you'd try to move on the inheritance without enough preparation. That Moojin would find out and escalate before we had enough to fight back. He held her eyes. And that when you knew everything, you would have no reason to let me anywhere near you. She looked at him for a long moment. That last one, she said. That's the real one. He didn't deny it. Tae-rin, she said. You protected evidence that belongs to me because you were afraid of what I'd do with my own inheritance, and because you didn't want to lose me. And those two things are not separate. They're the same thing dressed in different clothes. His jaw moved. I know, he said, do you? She kept her voice level. Because the man who loved me wasn't just keeping me safe. He was also keeping himself in a position where I still needed him, where I couldn't operate without his protection, where the documents were his to hold and the decisions were his to make, and I was the person at the center of a situation that everyone else had more information about than I did. She stopped. Do you see that? He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said. And then, because she had told him she needed honesty above everything else, I don't know if I made those choices consciously. But I can see the shape of what I built. And I'm not going to argue that the shape is different from what you're describing. Something in her chest did something complicated. This was the thing about Tae-rin that had always made him impossible to simply discard. Not that he was remorseful, anyone could perform remorse, but that when he was wrong, he had the specific and fairly rare capacity to look at the wrongness directly and not try to reframe it into something more comfortable. She didn't say any of that. Get the documents to Elias by tomorrow morning, she said. They'll be there tonight. She nodded. He stood to leave, and she said, Tae-rin. He stopped. The letter, she said. Whatever you were afraid I'd do with the truth, was it worth it? These last 6 months, knowing and not telling me. He looked at the envelope on the bedside table and then back at her. No, he said. It wasn't worth it for a single day. He left. Nyla sat alone with the letter and her sleeping daughter, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has had too many significant conversations in too few days, and whose body is also trying to recover from being cut open. She picked up the envelope again. She did not reread it. She just held it. The call came at 11:17 that night. Elias. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something between controlled and urgent. The voice of a man who has received information and is now deciding how to present it. Talk, she said. She was feeding Amara in the dark, the room lit only by the faint glow of the monitoring equipment. Moojin's team filed a supplemental motion 2 hours ago, Elias said. They've identified a legal argument I hadn't anticipated. What argument? The trustee clause, Elias said. The provision naming Tae-rin as designated trustee of your inheritance. She went still. What about it? Moojin's legal team is arguing that Tae-rin's role as trustee represents a conflict of interest that invalidates the estate filing. She waited. Their argument is this, Elias said. Tae-rin Kwon is the head of the Miru Syndicate. He was appointed trustee by Seong-wook, who founded the Miru Syndicate. Moojin's team is arguing that the inheritance was not a gift from a father to a daughter. It was a mechanism by which the head of an organized criminal enterprise transferred a significant ownership interest in legitimate corporations to a beneficiary under the control of his chosen successor. He paused. They're arguing that you, as the named beneficiary, are not an independent heir. You're a conduit. and that the inheritance is therefore not a legitimate estate transfer but a criminal asset arrangement. The room was very quiet. Amara made a small sound. Nyla kept her voice absolutely steady. "They're saying I'm being used," she said, "to transfer criminal assets. They're saying the inheritance was structured to appear legitimate while actually serving the interests of the Miru Syndicate. A sound like green wood splitting, and they're filing a motion to have the entire estate arrangement investigated by the State Attorney General's office on those grounds. If the Attorney General investigates, the legitimate companies connected to Miru Pacific Holdings get frozen pending investigation. Your 42% interest gets frozen, and Tae-rin Elias stopped. Tae-rin gets investigated for organized crime," Nyla said. "Yes, based on an argument that Moojin's own team constructed. An argument that is legally creative," Elias said carefully, but not without foundation. "The trustee arrangement is unusual. The relationship between Tae-rin and Seong-wook is documented. And Moojin's team has filed a sealed affidavit with their motion that they claim contains direct evidence of the Miru Syndicate's criminal operations." Nyla absorbed that. "Where did they get it?" she said. Elias was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. "Elias, where did Moojin's team get evidence of the syndicate's operations?" "The affidavit," Elias said, "cites a source inside Tae-rin's organization. The weight of that settled over everything. Someone inside Tae-rin's own operation had gone to Moojin. Someone who worked for Tae-rin, who knew the shape of the syndicate's activities, had either been turned or had gone voluntarily, and had handed Moojin the weapon he needed to reframe the entire inheritance dispute as a criminal enterprise investigation. Which meant Tae-rin's organization was not secure. Which meant anything Tae-rin's people knew about Nyla, her location, her situation, what Elias had, what Haewon had given them, any of it could have already moved in the wrong direction. "Get Tae-rin on the phone," she said. "Right now." "Nyla, right now." Elias. She held Amara against her shoulder while she waited for the call to connect, and she looked at the dark window and thought about the shape of what had just happened. Moojin had not simply filed a legal challenge. He had found a crack in the wall. He had found someone inside Tae-rin's operation who was willing to talk, and he had used that information to turn the entire situation inside out, to make Nyla's inheritance look like a criminal arrangement and make Tae-rin's protection of her look like a controlling an asset. And every move they had planned depended on Tae-rin's voluntary disclosure of the estate documents, creating a favorable legal posture. The medical records, Hound's evidence, the forensic accounting, all of it, had been building toward a position from which they could fight Moojin's competency challenge on the merits. That position was gone, because the moment the Attorney General's office began investigating the criminal enterprise angle, everything froze. Elias couldn't file. Tae-rin couldn't disclose. The evidence became entangled in a much larger question that would take years and subpoenas and federal coordination to untangle. And Moojin walked away with the hospital network and the inheritance and his father's empire intact. Tae-rin picked up on the second ring. "I know," he said. Before she said anything, I just heard. "Who?" she said. Pause. "I have 2 candidates," he said. "I need 4 hours to be certain." "You have 2 hours," she said. "Nyla, 2 hours," she said. "And I need you to understand something. Whatever you find, whoever it is, you bring it to me and to Elisis before you do anything else. You don't handle it the way you would have handled it 3 years ago. You bring it to me." The line was quiet for a moment. "Understood," he said. She hung up. She held Amara and looked at the dark window and thought about a man named Seong-wook who had planted a garden and watched his daughter from a distance and died without ever finding the courage to tell her the truth. She thought about the pattern. Every man in her life who had loved her had also in some way managed her. Managed what she knew. Managed what she had access to. Managed the circumstances that shaped what choices were available to her. She had spent 34 years being protected. She was done being protected. Whatever happened next, whatever move Moojin made, whatever crack appeared in whatever wall, she was going to be the one who decided how to respond. Not Tae-rin, not Elias, her. But first she needed to know who had gone to Moojin. because whoever it was had not just betrayed Tae-rin. They had betrayed her, and in doing so, they had handed a man who had already tried to leave her outside an emergency room the legal ammunition to take everything Seong-wook had left her and bury it in a federal investigation for the next decade. Amara stirred against her shoulder. Nyla pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "It's okay," she said. She did not feel okay. She felt the specific, cold, load-bearing clarity of a person who has run out of options that don't require them to become harder than they wanted to be. Tae-rin called back in 1 hour and 40 minutes. "I have a name," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, not the controlled register of the chairman, who never raised his voice. Something older than that. The voice of a man who has been hurt by someone he trusted, and who is deciding, in real time, what that means about every assumption he has ever made. "Tell me," she said. He told her the name. She knew it. Not personally, but she'd heard it mentioned twice in the past 3 days in passing. A mid-level operations manager, someone described as reliable, someone who had been with the organization long enough to know where bodies were buried in the figurative sense, and Nyla now understood the less figurative one. "How long has he been feeding information to Moojin?" she said. "At least 8 months, Tae-rin said. Possibly longer. 8 months. 8 months of everything they'd planned, every document held, every legal position map potentially visible to Moojin before they made a single move. He knew we were going to voluntary disclosure," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He knew about Haiwon's evidence. Pause that told her the answer was yes, Tae-rin. Her voice was very quiet now. "Does Moojin know where the original medical records are?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. And in that silence, Nyla Baptiste, 4 days out of surgery, holding her daughter in a dark hospital room, understood completely and without any remaining doubt that the plan they had built was not a plan anymore. It was a map that the enemy had already read. The silence on the phone lasted 4 seconds. Nyla counted them. "Does Moojin know where the original medical records are?" she said again. "He knows I have them," Tae-rin said. "He may know the location." "May. The records are in a secured facility."
"One of my properties."
"The location was known to 3 people inside my organization." A pause. "One of them is the man who went to Moojin." Nyla stood up. The incision pulled hard and immediate, and she breathed through it without making a sound, because making a sound was not useful right now. And she crossed to the bassinet and checked Amara with one hand while she kept the phone against her ear with the other. "How long before he moves on it?" she said. "If he already has the location tonight." "Tomorrow morning at the latest. Once the Attorney General motion is filed publicly, his leverage changes. He'll want the physical documents gone before anyone can subpoena them." Gone meaning destroyed. Yes. She stood at the bassinet and looked at her daughter's face in the dim light and thought about all the ways this could end. "Get the records out of there tonight," she said. "Right now. Don't wait for morning. I'm already moving people." "Tae-rin." Her voice dropped. "If your people get there and the records are already gone, then we're done," he said. "Without the original medical file, we cannot counter the competency challenge. The forged records Moojin submitted become the only documentation. The court has no basis to reject them, and the inheritance dies in litigation. Moojin's competency argument stands uncontested. The Attorney General investigation freezes everything else. It would take 5 years minimum to untangle, and Moojin has enough institutional relationships to ensure the investigation moves slowly." She absorbed that. "Call me the moment your people reach the facility," she said. She hung up. She stood in the dark room with her hand still resting on the edge of Amara's bassinet and thought about a man she had never met who had planted a garden and watched her from a distance and died without the courage to tell her who he was. She thought about his letter sitting on the bedside table in its cream envelope, with its careful handwriting. She thought about the clause naming Tae-rin trustee, which had been meant as protection and had become a weapon. She thought about Moojin sitting in this room with his calibrated smile and his 2-fingered business card and his word coincidence. She picked up her phone and called Elias. He answered on the first ring. "I know about the facility," she said. I need to know what we have left if the records don't make it out. Elias was quiet for a moment, and that moment told her he had already been running this scenario. Hae-won's evidence, he said. The email chain. The payment records for the credit interference. The draft reference letter with Moojin's metadata. Is that enough? To prove Moojin engaged in a sustained campaign of interference against you? Possibly yes. To counter the competency challenge without the medical records? No. Competency question is separate. The forged records need to be confronted with the genuine ones. Without the genuine file, we can argue that Moojin's records are suspicious, but we can't prove Seong-wook was competent. A judge, under pressure from an active attorney general investigation, will lean toward caution. And caution means freezing the estate pending resolution, which is what Moojin wants. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The incision throbbed in steady pulses that she had gotten better at cataloging and ignoring over the past 4 days. She pressed one hand flat against her abdomen, not for the pain, for the grounding of it, the physical fact of it, the reminder that she had survived, the thing that had tried to stop her before any of this began. Is there any other documentation of Seong-wook's cognitive status at the time of signing? She said. Anything outside the medical file? His attorney was present at the signing, Elias said. The Vancouver firm. I've been trying to reach them. Try harder, she said, tonight. Nyla, it's past midnight. I know what time it is. She kept her voice even. Find a home number. Find an emergency line. Find someone at that firm who understood what they were signing and can testify to Seong-wook's condition in that room. She stopped. He used a separate firm, specifically to avoid interference from the Kong family's regular attorneys. Those people knew why they were there. Find them. Understood, Elias said. She put the phone down. She lay back against the pillows carefully, managing the incision, and stared at the ceiling and waited. Tae-rin called at 12:53. She was awake, she had not slept. Talk, she said. They got there. His voice was controlled, in a way that meant something had gone wrong. The records were still there, but the facility had been accessed. Someone was already inside. The lock on the archive room was forced. Whoever went in was looking for something specific. They didn't take the medical file. She waited. They took the chain of custody documentation, he said. The paperwork establishing when the records were transferred to my custody, signed by Seong-wook's primary physician in Seoul. Without it, the medical file exists, but its provenance is unverifiable. Moojin's team can argue the file itself was altered or substituted after the fact. She closed her eyes, she opened them. The physician, she said. In Seoul, is he still alive? Dr. Park Sung-ho. He's 71. He retired 4 years ago. A pause. He's reachable. But getting a sworn statement from a retired Korean physician at 1 a.m, across international jurisdictions, in time to file before the Attorney General processes the motion. Where is he? Outside Busan. Can you get someone to him tonight? I have someone in Busan, Tae-rin said. The way he said it carried the weight of what kind of someone. But Nyla asking Dr. Park for a sworn statement at this hour, in this manner, it will frighten him. He's an old man. He treated Seong-wook as a patient and signed transfer documents as a professional courtesy. He didn't sign up for, then make sure whoever you send explains the situation clearly and gives him a genuine choice, she said. Not pressure. Information. Tell him what the forged records say. Tell him what his testimony would mean. Let him decide. Pause. That's not how I usually operate. I know, she said. It's how I do. He was quiet for a moment. I'll make the call, he said. Tae-rin. She stopped him before he hung up. The man who went to Moojin. What did you do with him? He's been removed from operations, Tae-rin said. He doesn't have access to anything further. Does Moojin know he's been identified? Not yet. She thought about that. Don't tell him, she said. Not yet. Why? Because a source Moojin thinks is still active is a resource we can use, she said. If Moojin believes his information pipeline is still open, he'll make his next move based on what he thinks we know, which we can control. The silence on the line changed quality. You want to feed him false information, Tae-rin said. I want to give Moojin a reason to move before he's ready, she said. Fast moves make mistakes. I want him to think he has more time than he does and less opposition than he does, and I want him to make a decision based on that. By the time he understands what actually happened, I want us to already be in the room. Another pause. Longer. You've been thinking about this since before I called, he said. I've been thinking about this since Elias told me about the source, she said. Go make your call to Busan. She slept 2 hours. Not because she was calm, because her body overrode her mind with the blunt democratic efficiency of a body that had been cut open 5 days ago and was tired of being ignored. She woke at 4:15 to a message from Elias, Vancouver firm. Found a partner. Standing by for your call, she called. Partner's name was Miriam Okafor Strand, 63, and she had the voice of someone who had been woken up at 2 in the morning Vancouver time and had made the assessment that whatever this was, it warranted the interruption. She was precise and careful, and she had been present in the room when Kong Seong-wook signed the estate documents. He was completely himself, she said, without preamble, once Nyla explained what the forged records claimed. I've been doing estate work for 31 years. I know what cognitive impairment looks like in a signing room. Song-wook was physically weakened. He was in pain. He didn't say so, but it was visible. But his mind, she paused. He read every page. He asked 3 questions about jurisdictional registration that required me to consult my notes. He caught a transcription error in the beneficiary clause that my own associate had missed. Another pause. He was completely himself. Will you provide a sworn statement to that effect? Nyla said. I've been waiting for someone to ask, Miriam said. I heard about the competency challenge 3 weeks ago through a colleague. I've had my assistant prepping the documentation since then. Nyla went still. You've been preparing. I'm an estate attorney. My professional reputation is connected to the validity of every document I witness. When someone challenges the competency of a signing I personally attended, that is a challenge to my professional integrity. Miriam's voice had an edge now. I did not fly to Seattle and spend 4 days in a room with that man to have his mental capacity questioned by a forged neurologist's report produced by someone who wasn't there. How soon can you file? My assistant has a flight to Seattle at 6 a. The affidavit will be in your attorney's hands by 9. After Nyla hung up, she sat in the pre-dawn quiet and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the night in the lobby. Not hope exactly, because hope was a thing that got managed, and she had been managed enough. Something more angular than hope. Traction. Elias arrived at the hospital at 7:30. He looked like a man who had also not slept but was running on the particular fuel of someone who has found a case with real tape and real teeth and is not willing to let go of it. He spread documents on the tray table. Miriam Okafor Strand's affidavit arrives at 9, he said. Dr. Park Sung-ho agreed to provide a sworn statement. Tae-rin's contact reached him at 2 a. His time, and he apparently said, and I'm quoting from the transcript, I have been expecting this call for 2 years. His statement is being notarized in Busan this morning and will be certified for international legal use within 6 hours. The chain of custody document. Gone. But with both Miriam's affidavit and Park's statement, we have 2 independent witnesses who can testify to Seong-wook's competency and the legitimate handling of his medical file. The missing chain of custody becomes not a problem, but a question mark. Question marks are manageable. The Attorney General motion, filed this morning, which means we're now on a clock. The AG's office will formally request documentation from all parties within 72 hours. What does that mean for us? It means we need to get in front of a judge with everything we have before the investigation framework locks things down. He paused. I filed this morning for an emergency hearing. Given the circumstances, a vulnerable party, documented fraud, an active competency challenge, the judge agreed to hear it tomorrow at 2 p. Tomorrow at 2, 29 hours. Mujin will be there, she said. With his full legal team. Yes. And the sealed affidavit from his source inside Tae-rin's organization. Elias nodded. That's the piece I can't neutralize on paper, he said. Whatever is in that affidavit, whatever Mujin's source told him about the syndicate's operations, will go to the criminal enterprise argument, which is designed to make you look like an unwitting vehicle for a criminal asset transfer, rather than a legitimate heir. Nyla looked at the documents on the table. I want to see the affidavit before the hearing, she said. It's sealed. Then unseal it, she looked at Elias. File a motion to access the affidavit on the grounds that it directly concerns my interests as the named beneficiary in the estate dispute. I have a right to confront evidence being used against me. Elias paused. That's actually viable. Legally creative, but viable. File it this morning. He was already writing. Sound like green win. Tate arrived an hour later. He looked like a man who had been conscious of that fact and had stopped of that fact because the problem in front of him was larger than his tiredness. There were lines around his eyes that she hadn't noticed in the first days, or that had deepened since then. He sat down across from her and put a folder on the tray table. The source, he said. His name is Park Dae-won. He's been with my organization for 9 years. He handled logistics on the legitimate side and had peripheral knowledge of the shadow operations. He opened the folder. He went to Moojin 8 months ago, voluntarily. Not because he was threatened, because Moojin paid him. How much? Enough that he'd already put a deposit on a property in Jeju. Nyla looked at the folder. What did he give Moojin? Operational structure, hierarchy. Enough to construct a credible picture of the syndicate's activities without exposing specific crimes that would require Dae-won to implicate himself. Tae-rin's jaw moved. He was careful. He gave Moojin what he needed for the criminal enterprise argument without giving him anything that would result in charges. Smart, Nyla said. Very. Can he be used against Moojin? Tae-rin looked at her. What do you mean? He's been feeding Moojin information for 8 months. Moojin trusts him. Moojin doesn't know we've identified him. She looked at Tae-rin steadily. What if Dae-won tells Moojin something? Something specific. Something that would cause Moojin to make a move he's not ready to make before tomorrow's hearing. Tae-rin was very still. You want Dae-won to give Moojin false intelligence, he said. I want Dae-won to give Moojin a reason to feel pressure, she said. Something that makes him believe we're further along than we are. Something that makes him do something visible. She paused. Because right now Moojin is playing a long game. He has the Attorney General motion. He has the competency challenge. He has the sealed affidavit. He's comfortable. He thinks he controls the timeline. She looked at Tae-rin. I want him uncomfortable. And if he gets uncomfortable and does something that exposes him, then we have more than a civil case, she said. Then we have conduct that Elias can use in the hearing tomorrow as evidence of ongoing bad faith. Tae-rin looked at the folder. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. This is stopped. This is not how I would have solved this problem. I know, she said. You're asking me to use a man who betrayed me as a tool. I'm asking you whether you want to win, she said. Not harshly. Directly. The silence stretched. What do I tell him to say? Tae-rin said. Dae-won was brought to a neutral location by 2 of Tae-rin's remaining trusted people at 10 that morning. He did not know why he'd been summoned, and he arrived with the specific body language of a man who is not yet sure whether he's been caught. Tae-rin was not in the room. Nyla was. She had discharged herself from the hospital against Dr. Choi's recommendation, not against her orders, because Choi was too precise a physician to issue orders she couldn't enforce, but against her strong professional advice, delivered with the particular clipped emphasis of someone who genuinely wanted her patient to stay in bed. Nyla had listened carefully and then signed the discharge papers. She was sitting in a chair when Dae-won came in, and she had Amara with her in the infant carrier against her chest. Because she had nowhere else to take her daughter and because the presence of a 5-day-old baby in a room sometimes did something to the quality of conversations that was difficult to manufacture any other way. Dae-won was 44 compact, with the face of a man who had been good at being unremarkable. He looked at Nyla, and then at Amara, and then at the 2 people who had brought him in, and his expression did the thing expressions do when a person realizes the situation is fundamentally different from what they had expected. Sit down, Nyla said. He sat. You know who I am, she said. Yes, he said. Then you understand that everything that happens in this room is connected to you in ways that will follow you regardless of what you decide in the next 10 minutes. She looked at him without heat, without particular anger, with the specific attention of someone who is taking accurate measure. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a choice, because choices are the thing I believe people deserve to have. You didn't extend that courtesy to me, but I'm extending it to you." He was very still. "Moojin paid you," she said. "You gave him enough information to construct a criminal enterprise argument that is currently being used to freeze my inheritance and potentially destroy Tae-rin's legitimate businesses." She paused. "What he doesn't know is that we know. What you can do is make one more contact with Moojin today, before noon, and give him information that will cause him to accelerate a move he's been planning." "What information?" Daewon said. His voice was careful. "Tell him that Dr. Park Sung-ho in Busan has refused to provide a statement. Tell him that the Vancouver attorney could not be reached. Tell him that our position going into tomorrow's hearing is weaker than he thinks." She watched his face. "Tell him we're planning to settle." Daewon looked at her. "He'll move on the documents," he said. "If he thinks you're about to settle from weakness, he'll try to destroy the physical records before the hearing, so there's nothing left to produce, even if you change your mind." "Yes," she said, "and if he does that, then we will have him on record attempting to destroy evidence in an active legal proceeding," she said, "which is a crime that exists entirely outside the estate dispute and the Attorney General's motion." She held his gaze. "One call. Everything you're carrying gets lighter." He looked at Amara. Amara was asleep. He looked back at Nyla. "And afterward," he said, "what happens to me?" "Afterward is not my department," she said. "That's between you and Tae-rin. But I can tell you that walking into tomorrow's hearing, having done one honest thing, is a better position than the one you're currently in." He sat with it for a long moment. Then he nodded. He made the call at 11:40. Nyla listened through the connection Tae-rin's people had set up, not because she didn't trust that Daewon would do it, but because she needed to hear Moojin's response herself. Moojin's voice was smooth and practiced, even on an unexpected call from an operational source. She listened to Daewon deliver the false intelligence, the failed contact in Vancouver, the refused statement from Busan, the rumor of a settlement approach, and she listened to the quality of the silence on Moojin's end when he absorbed it. She had been in enough negotiations to know what that silence meant. It meant calculation. It meant acceleration. He told Daewon to stand by and he ended the call. Nyla looked at Tae-rin across the room. "He'll move tonight," she said. "Yes. You have people on the facility." 8, he said. "And a secondary location where the copies are stored is that Moojin doesn't know about. If he goes for the physical records, we let him get close enough to document the attempt, and then we stop him." "Document it," she said. "I mean literally. I want footage. I want timestamps. I want something Elias can put in front of a judge at 2 o'clock tomorrow that shows Moojin attempting to destroy evidence in an active legal proceeding." "I understand." And Tae-rin, she looked at him. "No one gets hurt." He held her gaze. "I mean that," she said. "Whatever your people's instinct is, this ends in a courtroom. Not anywhere else." "Understood," he said, and she believed him, and that itself was a thing she was still learning how to hold. The difference between trusting Tae-rin's word and trusting Tae-rin's judgment, and the ongoing work of figuring out which parts of the distinction still mattered. Moojin moved at 2:17 in the morning. Nyla was awake. She had not expected to sleep. She was in Tae-rin's car outside the facility, which was not where she was supposed to be, and which Tae-rin had objected to with specific and detailed arguments that she had heard and rejected feeding Amara in the dark, while the people Tae-rin trusted most waited inside. She saw the vehicles arrive. 3 of them, unmarked, the kind of vehicles that announce their purpose. By the way they park precise and without hesitation, the parking of people who have done this before. 4 men got out. They were professionals. She could see that in the economy of their movement, in the way they communicated without apparent communication, small adjustments of position that indicated practice coordination. They did not make it past the entrance. Tae-rin's people had positioned themselves correctly, and the men found themselves stopped before they reached the archive room, surrounded in a way that made the geometry of their situation immediately clear, and they made the rational decision. One of them made a phone call. Nyla watched the phone go to his ear. She watched his face as whoever was on the other end spoke. She watched the call end. She watched all 4 men get back in their vehicles and leave. The whole thing lasted 11 minutes. She sat in the quiet car with Amara against her chest and looked at the building and thought about what Mujin was doing right now at 2:30 in the morning, receiving information that his move had failed and recalibrating. Tae-rin appeared at the car window. She lowered it. Everything's documented, he said. Footage, timestamps, vehicle plates. 2 of the men are identifiable from Miru Pacific's private security contractor roster. She nodded. Elias needs it by 6 a.m. It'll be there by 5. She looked at him through the window. He looked exhausted in a way that was different from tired. A whole-body exhaustion that comes from sustained alertness over days, the kind that settles into the eyes and the set of the jaw. Get in the car, she said. He came around and got in the passenger side. He looked at Amara and then at Nyla. You shouldn't be here, he said. I know, she said. I needed to see it. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Because every decision that's been made about my life, for the last 3 years, every move, every protection, every strategy has been made by people who were trying to handle things on my behalf, she said. I needed to be in the room, or the parking lot. She looked at him. I needed to be the person who saw what happened and decided what it meant. He was quiet. The hearing is at 2, she said. I know. Mujin will be there with everything he has. She looked at the building. Criminal enterprise argument. The sealed affidavit. Whatever he reconstructs from tonight. And we have Miriam's affidavit. Park's statement. Hae-won's evidence. And footage of his people attempting to destroy evidence in an active proceeding, Tae-rin said. Yes. She paused, and me. He looked at her. I'm going to speak, she said. The hearing. Not through Elias. I want to address the criminal enterprise argument directly. I want to stand in that room and make the judge understand what this is actually about. She looked at him. Mujin has spent 3 years trying to make me invisible. I am going to make sure that is the last time he succeeds at anything where I'm concerned. Tae-rin looked at her for a long moment. He started to say something. She shook her head. Don't tell me it's risky, she said. Don't tell me Elias should handle it. Don't protect me from this. He closed his mouth. He looked at his hands. What do you need from me? He said. She looked at him directly. That was the right question. That was the first time in everything she could remember of knowing him that he had asked it that way. Not what can I still placed him as the actor, but what do you need from me, which placed her as the one who defined the terms. The truth, she said. All of it. Whatever is still in that folder of yours that I haven't seen yet, I need it tonight. Before we walk into that room, I need to know everything you know. He reached into his jacket. He produced a folded document she hadn't seen before. He held it for a moment. There is one more thing, he said. In the estate filing. A clause I didn't tell Elias about because I wasn't sure how to he stopped. There is a provision that Seong-wook included specifically regarding the Miru syndicate. A dissolution clause. She looked at the document. What does it say? She said. It says, Tae-rin said, that in the event Nyla Baptiste formally asserts her inheritance claim, the designated trustee, meaning me, is required to begin the formal dissolution of the Miru syndicate within 12 months. Seong-wook built in a mechanism to dismantle his own shadow empire the moment his hidden daughter came forward to claim her place in his legitimate one. He held her eyes. He used the inheritance as a trigger. If you claim what's yours, I am legally obligated to dismantle what he built. Car was very quiet. Amara slept. He wanted it gone, Nyla said. He wanted it gone, Tae-rin said. And he knew the only person with enough standing to force the trigger was someone Mujin couldn't control and I couldn't protect into silence. She looked at the document. She looked at Tae-rin. You've known about this clause the entire time, she said. Yes. So when you chose to protect the documents, instead of giving them to Mujin, I was also choosing to protect the dissolution clause, he said, which would eventually require me to give up everything I built inside what Seong-wook left behind. He looked at her without flinching. I knew that. From the beginning, she held his gaze. And you still chose to protect it? Yes. Even knowing it would cost you? Yes. The pre-dawn Seattle dark pressed against the car windows, and Nyla Baptiste sat with her daughter asleep against her chest, and looked at the man who had lied to her and loved her and protected her badly and chosen, when it came to the final accounting, to keep the document that would eventually require him to give up the only world he'd ever known. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not the thing this moment called for. What it called for was something she was still learning, the shape of the ability to hold two true things at once without needing to resolve the tension between them into something simpler. He had hurt her. He had also chosen, every time it cost him something real, to protect her truth over his own comfort. 12 months, she said. From the date you formally assert the claim, he said. Then let's go win the hearing, she said, so the clock can start. She handed him Amara. He took her daughter with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what he was holding, and was not going to pretend otherwise. And Nyla reached for the door handle and opened it, and stood into the cold Seattle pre-dawn air, and felt the incision pull and breathed through it and looked at the building where the records were still intact, and thought about a courtroom at 2:00, and a man who was going to walk in there with everything he had. She was going to walk in with everything she was. That would have to be enough. The hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Courtroom 7 of the King County Superior Court, and Nyla arrived at 1:15. She arrived early because she had always arrived early to things that mattered. It was a habit she'd developed in the group home, where arriving late meant someone else had already taken the best chair, the defensible position, the seat with the wall behind it. The instinct had served her in boardrooms and depositions and difficult conversations, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. She was wearing the charcoal blazer she had bought 2 years ago for a client presentation. It was slightly looser than it had been before the pregnancy, which she hadn't anticipated, and which she had noticed that morning with the particular flatness of someone who had run out of emotional bandwidth for minor indignities. She wore it anyway. It was the right blazer for this. Elias met her in the hallway with 3 folders and the expression of a man who had been awake for 31 hours and had stopped noticing. Miriam's affidavit is filed, he said. Park Sung-ho's statement was certified at 5 a.m. and is in the record. The footage from last night has been submitted as Exhibit F, with a chain of custody declaration from Tae-rin's property manager. He paused. The motion to unseal Mujin's affidavit was denied. But the footage, Nyla, the footage is clean. 2 of the 4 men are on Miru Pacific's private security contractor payroll. That connection is documented, and the criminal enterprise argument still live. The Attorney General's motion is still active. What I've been able to do is file a responsive brief arguing that the criminal enterprise theory is itself evidence of bad faith litigation strategy, given the documented pattern of interference and last night's evidence destruction attempt. He looked at her. Good work. But the judge has discretion. I don't know which way she leans on something this complex. Who is she? Judge Patricia Wren, 61, 22 years on the bench. State cases, civil disputes, some criminal adjacent work. He picked his word rigorous. Good, Nyla said. I want rigorous. You said you wanted to speak. I do. I've prepared a framework for your statement, if you want to look at it. I don't, she said. Not unkindly. I know what I'm going to say. He looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who wanted to argue and had decided against it. Tae-rin is already inside, he said. And Mujin. Him too. She straightened the blazer. She picked up her bag. Let's go, she said. Courtroom 7 was smaller than she'd imagined. The ceiling was high, but the floor plan was compact. The kind of room where the distance between opposing parties across the aisle is close enough that you can hear the other side, breathing if the room gets quiet enough. Mujin was already seated at the respondent's table with 2 attorneys she didn't recognize, and a third she did, a senior partner from a firm whose name appeared on enough Pacific Northwest legal filings that Nyla had encountered it. In her professional life, before any of this began, he was well represented. He had arrived prepared. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Tae-rin was in the gallery, not at the petitioner's table. His role in the proceeding was as a witness and as the named trustee, not as a party. a distinction that Elias had explained and that Mujin's team had tried unsuccessfully to complicate. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his back straight and his eyes on Nyla as she settled into her chair. She didn't look at him. She needed to think about Tae-rin after. Not during. Haewon was also in the gallery. She had come alone, no attorneys, no staff, and she sat 3 rows behind Mujin in a position that meant if he turned around, he would see her. He had not turned around yet. Judge Patricia Ren, 203. Patricia Ren entered at 2 and sat, and she looked at her materials for 30 seconds before looking up. And in those 30 seconds, Nyla read her face and understood what Elias had meant by rigorous. She was not cold. She was not performatively neutral. She was simply a person who had spent 22 years listening to people fight over things that mattered and had developed the particular quality of attention that comes from genuinely caring about getting it right. "We're here on the matter of the Kang estate petition," Judge Ren said. "I've reviewed the submitted materials, including the petition, the respondent's competency challenge, the responsive brief filed this morning, and the various evidentiary submissions including," she glanced at her notes, "the affidavit from Miss Okafor-Strand, the statement from Dr. Park, and what has been filed as Exhibit F." She looked up. "I have questions. We'll start with Respondent's counsel on the competency challenge." Mujin's lead attorney was a man named Garrett Phelps who had the measured confidence of someone who had won a lot of cases and expected to win this one. He laid out the competency argument with the practiced efficiency of a person who had delivered this particular structure before. The progression of Seong-wook's illness, the purported neurologist's report, the argument that a man in advanced cancer's final stage could not be considered reliably competent to execute complex estate documents. Judge Ren let him finish. Then she said, "The neurologist whose report you've submitted." "Doctor," she consulted her notes. "Han Jae-young is doctor." "Han available to testify," Phelps said. "Dr. Han is currently unavailable due to a prior commitment." "Prior commitment," Judge Ren said. "That is correct, Your Honor." The judge looked at him for a moment with an expression that said several things, without saying any of them. Ms. Baptiste. Elias stood. He presented Miriam Okafor-Strand's affidavit and Dr. Park's statement with the particular methodical precision that good estate attorneys develop each document placed in context, each piece of evidence connected to the next, the overall structure building toward a coherent picture of a competent man who had made deliberate and considered choices in the final months of his life. When Elias finished, Judge Ren looked at the documents for a long moment. "I'd like to hear from Ms. Baptiste directly," she said. Phelps started to object. Judge Ren looked at him. He stopped. Nyla stood. She had thought about what she was going to say since 2 o'clock that morning in the parking lot outside the storage facility. She had not written it down. Writing it down would have made it a speech, and a speech was not what this moment needed. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm going to say something that isn't in any of the documents." Judge Ren nodded once. "I didn't know who my father was until 5 days ago," Nyla said. "I was born to a man who chose his family's expectations over his own conscience, and then spent the rest of his life watching me from a distance and calling it protection." She kept her voice even. It was not difficult. She had been preparing for this her whole life without knowing it. 3 years ago, when my father died and left me an inheritance, the man sitting at that table, she indicated Mujin without looking at him, began a systematic effort to ensure I would never be in a position to claim it. He interfered with my credit, with professional opportunities, with insurance. He did not do these things clumsily or impulsively. He did them carefully, over time, with the patience of someone who understood that grinding down another person's financial standing and professional credibility is more durable than confronting them directly. The room was very quiet. "The competency challenge is the last move in that campaign," she said. "Not the first. The first move was 3 years ago. The most recent move before this one was 12 days ago, when he authorized the suspension of my insurance coverage, knowing I was 35 weeks pregnant and classified as high risk, knowing I would come to his hospital and be turned away." She paused. "And the move he made last night, attempting to access a secured location, holding the original medical records of a deceased patient in an active legal proceeding, is documented in Exhibit F." She stopped there. She let the room hold what she'd said. Then she said, I am not asking this court to give me anything. I'm asking it to confirm what my father legally left me. The documents establishing that inheritance are legitimate. The witnesses who can testify to my father's competency are credible. The challenge mounted against me is not a good faith legal dispute over an ambiguous estate. It is the continuation of a 3-year effort to make me invisible. She looked at the judge. I have spent my entire life becoming visible, in spite of everything that tried to prevent it. I am done being erased. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for another 3 seconds. Judge Ren looked at her documents. She looked at Phelps. She looked at Mu Jin, directly, with the steady appraisal of someone who has spent 2 decades reading people across a courtroom and has gotten very good at it. Respondent's counsel, she said. The neurologist whose report you've submitted cannot be produced for testimony. The 2 independent witnesses who were physically present at the signing have provided sworn statements directly contradicting that report. You've also filed an affidavit from a source you've declined to name publicly, alleging criminal enterprise. She paused while simultaneously your client's private security contractors were documented last night attempting to access a storage facility containing estate-related documents. She set down her pen. I'm going to need you to help me understand why I should treat the competency challenge as a legitimate legal dispute rather than as Mr. Phelps just characterized it himself last week, in a different courtroom, a strategic tool. Phelps began to speak. Judge Ren held up one hand. That was not a question I needed answered verbally, she said. It was a question I needed you to hear. The ruling came at 4:47. Judge Ren rejected the competency challenge. She cited the affidavit and Dr. Park's statement as credible evidence, directly contradicting the submitted neurological report, noted the unavailability of the respondent's expert witness as a significant factor in assessing the challenge's legitimacy, and formally entered the Kang estate petition into active consideration. She also issued a preservation order covering all estate-related documents and a formal notice to the Attorney General's office that the criminal enterprise theory advanced by respondent's counsel had been submitted in the context of an active legal proceeding for the same party had engaged in what she characterized as, at minimum, highly questionable conduct with respect to the security of relevant documents. She did not dismiss the Attorney General's motion. That was not within her authority. What she did was put a flag on it. In the language of legal proceedings, that flag would slow the investigation's momentum for long enough to matter. Elias touched Nyla's arm when the gavel came down and said something she didn't immediately hear because she was watching Mu Jin. He was sitting very still at the respondent's table. His attorneys were leaning in, speaking quietly, and he was listening with his hands flat on the table and his face composed in that particular way she recognized. The way of a man who had prepared for a different outcome and was now recalibrating in real time. He looked up. He found her eyes across the room. She held his gaze. She did not feel triumphant. She felt she searched for the word and found it accurate. She felt like the shape of things had been corrected. Like a column of figures that had been wrong for years and was now finally reconciled. It wasn't the same thing as victory. Victory was too clean. This was messier and more real. She found him in the hallway outside. Not Tae-rin, not Elias, who was managing the post-hearing documentation with the focused intensity of a man who understood there was still significant work ahead. Mu Jin. He was standing near a window at the end of the hallway, jacket still buttoned, hands in his pockets, looking out at the street below with the posture of a man who has learned to appear composed when he isn't. His attorneys had gone ahead. She walked toward him. He heard her coming. The hallway was marble. Her heels were not loud, but they were present, and he turned before she reached him. She stopped 4 feet away. The offer I'm about to make, she said, I'm making once. If you decline it, I will pursue every avenue of legal remedy available to me, and I will do it publicly. He looked at her. Speak, he said. You keep your 58% in your operational position, she said. I take my 42% and a board seat. You compensate me for documented damages, the credit interference, the contract termination, the professional losses. The figure will be determined by forensic accounting, and it will be fair, which means it will not be comfortable. She paused. You withdraw the competency challenge formally, and you acknowledge in writing before the board that my position is legitimate. He was very still, and in return, I keep this out of the press, she said. What I have, what Hae-won gave me, what last night documented, what Elias can build from 3 years of evidence, I keep it contained within a legal settlement. I do not go to the Seattle Times. I do not go to the financial press. I do not give interviews about what the acting chairman of Maru Pacific Medical Group did to a pregnant woman outside his own emergency room. She looked at him steadily. That's the offer. He looked out the window. He looked back at her. You could destroy me completely, he said. Yes, she said. I could. Why don't you? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because destruction isn't the same as justice, she said. And because there are people who work for this company who had nothing to do with what you did. And because she stopped and then said the true thing, even though it cost her something to say it. Because you're the only other person alive who knew him. Song-wook. Whatever he was to me, he was your father too. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life turning that into a war. Something moved across his face. She had not expected what came next. He reached into his jacket and removed an envelope. Cream-colored. The handwriting on the front was the same handwriting she had seen on the letter Tae-rin had given her, that careful, tired handwriting of a man whose hands were failing him. This one had Moojin's name on it. He left one for me too, Moojin said. He held it for a moment. I read mine the night he died. I have read it many times since. He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it. You don't have to show me this, she said. I know, his jaw moved. He wrote something in mine about you. About what he called his cowardice. He paused. He said that he had 2 children who deserved a father, and had gotten a man who was afraid of what loving them honestly would cost him. He stopped. I have spent 3 years being angry at you for something that was his failure and my fear. The hallway was very quiet. I know that doesn't, he started. It doesn't undo it, she said. No, but I heard it, she said. She gave him back the envelope. He took it. I'll need 48 hours to consult with my attorneys, he said. You have 24, she said. He nodded once. He walked away down the hallway without looking back. She stood at the window and watched the street below, and breathed through the incision which had been making itself loudly known for the past 2 hours, and thought about the envelope in her pocket with her own name on it in her dead father's handwriting. Hae-won was waiting outside the building. The rain had stopped temporarily, in the way Seattle rain stops, with the implication that it is simply resting, and the afternoon light was doing what November light does in the Pacific Northwest. Arriving at a low angle that made everything look simultaneously beautiful and exhausted. Hae-won had her coat on and her arms crossed not in defensiveness, but in the way people cross their arms when they are cold and don't want to say so. She looked at Nyla when she came out and looked at Amara in the infant carrier against Nyla's chest, because Nyla had brought her daughter into a courthouse today, because she had nowhere else to take her, and because some part of her had wanted Amara present for this, even if Amara would never remember it. How did it go? Hae-won said. We won the first round, Nyla said. There are more rounds. Hae-won nodded. They stood together in the cold for a moment. He'll take the settlement, Hae-won said. Moojin. He's not, she paused, picking her words carefully. He's not a stupid man. He makes terrible choices when he's afraid, but he's not stupid. He knows when the position is untenable. You know him better than I do, Nyla said. I know him better than I wish I did. Hae-won looked at the street. He was not always what he became after our father died. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it's true. Nyla looked at her. I know, she said. Do you? I'm learning, she said. That people are more than the worst thing they do. It doesn't mean the worst thing they do stops mattering. Both things are true. Hae-won was quiet for a moment. I want to meet her properly, she said. She was looking at Amara. When you're ready. Not in a hospital room, not in a crisis. Just properly. Come to the waterfront estate, Nyla said. Surprised her slightly that those were the words that came out. Song-wook's estate. I want to see the garden. I don't want to go alone. Hae-won looked at her. Her eyes were wet, quickly, and without drama, and she pressed her lips together and looked away for a moment. Yes, she said. Tell me when. The settlement was signed 11 days later. Moojin's attorneys negotiated hard for 72 hours and then stopped negotiating because there was nothing left to negotiate toward. The forensic accounting produced a damages figure that was, as Nyla had told him it would be, fair and not comfortable. He signed without theatrical protest. She would give him that. When a man like Moojin loses, he loses with a certain kind of controlled dignity that is its own form of pride, and he exercised it now. The competency challenge was formally withdrawn. The board of Miru Pacific Holdings convened an emergency session 2 weeks after the hearing, and Nyla Baptiste took her seat at the table for the first time. She had worn a different blazer, navy. It fit correctly. She looked at the faces around the table, some neutral, some wary, 2 or 3 openly curious. One man on the far end who seemed to be calculating something, and she did not perform confidence she did not feel. She felt the incision, which was still healing. She felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been awake for significant portions of the past 2 weeks, managing a newborn and a legal battle simultaneously. She felt the strange, weightless quality of sitting in a room that had been built by a man she never knew who was her father. She felt all of it at once, and she let it be present, and then she said, "I'd like to begin with the emergency admissions protocol." Everyone at the table looked at her. "I've reviewed the network's current financial clearance process," she said. "Specifically, the sequence of steps that allows financial administrators to delay or deny emergency care pending insurance verification." She set 3 pages on the table in front of her. She had spent 2 days writing this, in the margins of nursing sessions, and in the 45-minute windows when Amara slept. "I'm proposing a full override mechanism. Any patient presenting to an emergency department with clinical indicators of a medical emergency is admitted first. Financial clearance happens after stabilization, without exception." She looked around the table. "I'd like this implemented network-wide within 90 days. Moojin, at the far end of the table, said nothing. He looked at the pages she had distributed. After a moment, he said, "The liability implications would need to be assessed." "I've included a framework for that on page 2, she said. He looked at page 2, a long pause. "I'll have my team review it," he said. It was not an endorsement. It was not nothing either. She went to the waterfront estate on a Saturday in late December, 3 weeks after the settlement. Haewon was already there when she arrived, standing on the path that led from the main building down toward the water, wearing a coat that was too light for the temperature and holding 2 cups of coffee from a place that was not near here, which meant she had gone out of her way. She held one out when Nyla came down the path. Nyla took it. Black, no sugar. She hadn't told Haewon how she took it. "I looked it up," Haewon said, catching the look on her face. "I wanted to get it right." Nyla looked at her. Something in her chest moved in a way that she didn't try to name. "Thank you," she said. They walked down toward the garden together. It was a large garden, larger than Nyla had imagined from the letter's description. Seong-wook had clearly spent serious money on it, not for ostentation but for specificity. The plantings were deliberate and considered, chosen for the Seattle climate. Designed to survive in layers so that something was always alive, regardless of season. In December, most things were dormant, but the structure of it was visible. The paths, the raised beds, the oldest tree at the center that Seong-wook's letter had mentioned. A Douglas fir that had been here before him and would be here after all of them. Nyla stood at the base of the fir and looked up. The trunk was broader than her arm span. The bark was deeply furrowed, rust brown and gray, the texture of something that had been deciding to survive for a very long time. She put her hand against it. The bark was cold and rough under her palm. She thought about a man who had stood in this same spot and thought of a daughter in another city and had not been able to find the courage to close the distance. She thought about what that cost him, the specific, private, unwitnessed cost of choosing safety over truth over and over for 30 years. Greenwood Splittis. She thought about the letter and the words Coward written in his own hand, which was the most honest thing he ever said to her, and which he had only been able to say when he was gone. Not. She took her hand off the bark. She did not forgive him. She also did not need to. She was beginning to understand. Forgiveness was for wounds still open. This was something older, something she had been carrying, so long it had become structural. The absence of a father. She had never known enough about to mourn specifically. What she could do with that was not forgive it. What she could do was put it down. She let it down. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. She just stopped carrying it, or started the process of stopping, which would take longer than a moment in a garden, but had to begin somewhere. Amara was in the carrier against her chest, bundled against the cold, and Nyla looked down at her daughter's face, the face that was already its own face, already particular, already something beyond the compressed newborn features of the first days, and thought will not grow up without knowing who she is. That was the one thing Nyla could guarantee. Not safety. Not a smooth path. Not a world that treated her fairly, or a family that was uncomplicated, or a father who had made no mistakes. But the truth. She would know the truth of where she came from, including all the hard parts, as early as it could be given to her in forms she could hold. That was enough to start with. Mujin arrived an hour later. She hadn't been sure he would come. She hadn't been sure he would either. They hadn't discussed it. But Nyla had read the uncertainty in how Haewon had been looking at the path since they arrived. He came on foot from the main building, no staff, no attorneys, wearing a dark coat that was more appropriate for the temperature than Haewon's. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly down against the wind off the water. He stopped at the edge of the garden path. He looked at the tree. He looked at Nyla. He looked at Amara. Something in his face did something quiet and complicated. "She has Song-wook's ears," he said. Nyla looked at her daughter. She hadn't seen it before. Now she couldn't unsee it. "Come into the garden," Haewon said. Her voice was careful and steady, the voice of someone navigating a situation that might collapse if handled with anything less than complete steadiness. He planted it. "We should all be able to stand in it." Mujin looked at his sister. He walked into the garden. The three of them stood in the cold under the fir tree, and no one said anything for a long moment. It was not a comfortable silence. It was not an easy silence. It was the silence of three people who share blood and almost nothing else, standing in a dead man's garden and trying to understand what the word family was going to mean for the remainder of their lives. "I have a condition," Nyla said, "for the estate property. Before I sign the final settlement documents." Mujin looked at her. "This property," she said. "The estate, the garden, all of it. It belongs equally to the three of us, not in shares. Equally, and none of us can sell or develop or alter any part of it without unanimous consent from all three." Pause. "Why?" Mujin said. "Because he planted it for all of us," she said. "Even when he only admitted to some of us." She looked at him directly. "And because I want there to be one thing we can't do to each other. One thing that requires us to come to the table every time." Haewon made a small sound that was not quite a word. Mujin looked at the tree. He looked at Amara. He looked at Nyla with the expression of a man who has been at war for 3 years and has just been offered peace on terms he didn't write and isn't sure he deserves. "Already said. Tae-rin was outside the gate. She had known he would be. She had told him where she was going and when, and she had not told him to come. And she had not told him not to come, and she had understood that he would interpret that with the particular precision of a man who was learning. Slowly and with effort, the difference between being present and being presumptuous. He was standing outside the gate with his hands in his coat pockets, and no one beside him, no staff, no security, no one between him and whatever the world decided to do. And when she came up the path toward him, he didn't move forward to meet her. He waited. She stopped at the gate. She looked at him through the iron bars, which was a more dramatic framing than the situation probably warranted, and she thought about everything she could say. She thought about the letter, which she had read 12 times. Scenes, Mit. She thought about the dissolution clause, which Tae-rin's attorneys had formally registered with the court the week after the hearing 12 months. The clock was running. She thought about the Maru syndicate, the specific and enormous work of unwinding an organization that had been built over decades and embedded in legitimate structures in ways that would take years to fully separate. She thought about the fact that Tae-rin had chosen to begin that work, without being ordered to, had filed the registration voluntarily, had started making calls and meetings and arrangements that were costing him something real every day. She thought about what it meant to change, not the performance of change, not the announcement of change, but the actual grinding, daily work of becoming different from what you had been. She thought about how she had not forgiven him either. Forgiveness was a longer road than a garden. But she had also spent 2 weeks watching him make different choices than he had made before, smaller choices, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind that only mean something if you're paying attention to the pattern. Telling Elias things before he told her, asking what she needed before he decided what to do, showing up at the hospital to bring her coffee, and leaving when she asked him to leave, and coming back when she said she needed the documents and not arguing about either. The pattern was different. The pattern was new. New didn't mean safe. New didn't mean she owed him anything. New meant he was doing the work, and she could see it, and she was going to decide what she did with it. She opened the gate. "You can come in," she said, "if you want to." He looked at her. "I want to," he said. "Then come in," she said. "But I need you to know something first." He waited. "Love doesn't erase betrayal," she said. "I know you know that. I need you to also know that I'm not waiting for it to. I'm not standing here expecting to get back to something we had before, because before wasn't honest, and I'm not interested in reconstructing it." She looked at him. "What I'm willing to do is start from here, from what's actually true. No protection I didn't ask for, no decisions you make for me, because you're afraid of what I'll do. No information you hold because you think I'm not ready." She paused. "Can you do that?" "I'm going to get it wrong sometimes," he said. "I know that. And when I get it wrong, then you tell me," she said. "And I tell you. And we figure out if what we're building is worth the work of figuring it out." She held his eyes. "That's all I'm offering. Not a guarantee, a chance." He was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She stepped back from the gate. He walked through. No bodyguards, no soldiers. No armor built from years of being the chairman. Just a man in a coat walking through a gate into a dead man's garden on a cold December afternoon, choosing to be only himself when only himself was what was wanted. They walked down toward the tree together. Moojin and Haewon had moved apart, not on conflict, just giving each other the particular space that siblings who have been through something difficult sometimes need. Haewon was crouching at one of the dormant garden beds, looking at something in the soil. Moojin was standing near the water's edge, with his hands behind his back. Tae-rin stopped when he saw them. He had not expected Moojin. "Fine," Nyla said. He looked at her. "It's not simple," she said. "But it's fine." She went to the fir tree and took Amara out of the carrier. Carefully, managing the incision, which was better but not gone, and she held her daughter against the trunk of the tree the way the letter had described. The oldest tree, the one Song Wook had specifically mentioned, as if he knew she would come here eventually and wanted to leave something for this moment. Amara's small hand splayed open the way. Infant hands are always splayed, pressed against the bark. The cold bark. The bark that had been here before all of them. Nyla held her daughter's hand splitting. Nyla held her daughter's hand against the tree and thought about the woman in Chicago who had raised her alone and had died too young and had sent one letter to a soul address and had never known what became of it. She thought about Nyla Baptiste, who had been 26 and surprised by love, and then returned to America carrying something she hadn't planned for and had made a life from it anyway. That was where she came from, not from the Empire. Not from Seong Wook's money, or his garden, or his sealed estate documents. From a woman who had found herself alone with something difficult, and had not put it down. The empire was hers by right, and she would use it well. She already had plans, more plans than she'd told anyone yet, for what 42% of a hospital network could do, for people who were told no when they needed yes. A sound like green proposals in the new year, and some of them would be uncomfortable, and she was prepared for the discomfort to be distributed rather than absorbed. But that was tomorrow's work. Today's work was this. Standing in a garden in December, with her daughter and her 2 half-siblings, and the man she was choosing to start again with, and setting down what was too heavy to carry forward. "We should come back in spring," Haewon said from the garden bed. She was still crouching, still looking at whatever was in the soil. When things are growing again. There are bulbs here. I can see the tops. She looked up at Nyla. He planted bulbs. They'll come up. Nyla looked at the garden. Yes, she said. We should. Mujin said nothing from the water's edge. But he didn't leave. Tae-rin stood at a respectful distance from the tree and watched Nyla with Amara and did not say anything or try to make it mean something it wasn't yet ready to mean. He had learned something in the last 2 weeks about what it looked like to be present without filling the room. Nyla took her daughter's hand from the bark. She held Amara close against the cold. She looked at the garden, at the dormant beds and the paths and the tree that had been here long before any of them and would be here after, and she thought about everything that could not be returned. The years she didn't have a father. The years Tae-rin had spent holding a truth that belonged to her. The version of herself that might have existed if none of the interference had happened. The smoother path, the higher. She let those go, not because they didn't matter, because carrying them forward would cost her more than she's to spend. What she had was the truth. What she had was Amara. What she had was a seat at a table that had tried to keep her out, and plans for what she was going to do with it, and a sister who had shown up quietly and without certainty and done the right thing when it was hard, and a brother who had done the wrong thing and was going to have to spend a long time proving he could be different, and a man at the edge of the garden learning, with difficulty and genuine effort, what it meant to love someone without managing them. None of it was clean. None of it was what she would have chosen. All of it was hers. The wind came off the water, cold and direct in the way Seattle wind is honest. Nyla Baptiste turned her face into it. She did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago how to stand in the rain.